Chapter 617. Through the misty forest, Brando, accompanied by Freya, saw Wood. This was the second time he had seen the Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire since he was an Ampere Seal. Seeing Mephisto standing next to Wood, Brando hurriedly saluted, "Teacher." Although Saint Tassol taught him the 9 luminary sword art, Mephisto also taught him a lot of practical skills. Nominally, they also had the status of teacher and student, and the Elf Queen did not object to this. Wood glanced at Mephisto with slight surprise. "So that's how it is, you have a good student." "Indeed." Brando looked up and saw several red-robed knights of the Holy Cathedral behind the two of them. He couldn't help but squint his eyes into a line, trying to figure out Wood's intentions. However, Wood had made him suffer a big loss in the name of Tumen, and Brando would never forget this lesson. Seeing Brando's expression, the Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire smiled awkwardly. "It seems that Mr. Brando has a deep prejudice against me." He suppressed the surprise in his heart. Knight Williams brought 10 knights of the Holy Cathedral. Even if the Canolia fleet was blocked by Erwin's royal fleet, it would not be wiped out immediately, not to mention the White-Winged Knight Regiment. But what he saw was the dejected cruise people who were restrained, and the flag of the White-Winged Knight Regiment was thrown into the muddy water. He didn't know if the Holy Cathedral had been too greedy for comfort for a long time, or if its enemies were too strong. Wood looked at the young man in front of him, and a strong sense of uneasiness surged in his heart. "Lord Archbishop, you know the proverb of the elves, everyone gets what they do." Brando replied. "Haha," Wood smiled bitterly, "so I'm here to taste the bitter fruit I planted back then." But Mr. Brando knows that this is not prejudice. The Holy Cathedral always needs a stable Erwin. "So you chose the nobles of the north?" Brendel's eyebrows were raised in an aggressive manner. Wood was right. From the standpoint of the cruise people, there was no need for him to put himself in the enemy's shoes. He was not so kind. Whether it is the cruise people or the Erwin people, they are all descendants of the Flame King. They have to uphold the honor. The Cypher royal family had long lost their throne. After the O'Casey siblings lost the Lionheart sword, this matter became known to the world. At that time, the nobles vowed to abdicate Hesse I's throne, and promised that his heirs would no longer covet the throne. Therefore, Erwin today has no second heir other than Prince Haruz. I admit that the Holy Sanctum did not consider this matter properly. Moros was too stubborn and I could not stop him." Wood sighed. Brando watched helplessly as Wood put the blame on the dead Moros. Wood was different from Williams. He was a typical pragmatist, but the other side said so, which was already a concession. This made him feel a little vigilant because the Holy Cathedral of Fire's compromise was almost unnecessary. He stared at Wood warily. The chief priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire smiled bitterly again. "You don't have to doubt, I am here on behalf of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to ask Her Royal Highness Princess Griffin for peace." Freya, who was behind Brando, could not help but let out a soft cry. This time it was really Brando's turn to be surprised. Was it just for the Canolia fleet? But wasn't the face of the Empire more important than a local fleet? If the cruise people really thought so, they would be a terrible opponent. But Brando thought of another possibility. "Williams is dead." "He died in your hands?" Wood was stunned. "Yes." Brando nodded. This was a secret that could not be hidden. Besides, Mephisto was on the side, and he was not worried that the cruise people would turn hostile. The chief priest of the Holy Cathedral of Fire was silent. "This is indeed a problem," he muttered to himself. "But Williams is grumpy and arrogant. His stubbornness led to his death in a foreign land, which is not unreasonable." "What?" Brando almost thought he had heard wrong. "Brando, I'm afraid that the cruise people don't have the time to go around biting people, just like the dog that fell into the mud to fight for the bone. They can't even protect themselves. But we also have a problem, but you can now make conditions to them." Mephisto finally spoke, and as soon as he spoke, the knight behind Wood glared at him. "Can't protect themselves? Mr. Brando, I hope the princess will give up the pursuit of the Canolia fleet," Wood said. "That's impossible," Brando refused firmly, but he paused and asked, "What are the conditions?" Wood smiled. Sure enough, as he expected, the real mastermind behind the princess' side was this young man. But what made him feel uneasy was that the other party was the same kind of person as him. The Holy Cathedral was going to bleed a lot this time. "We can make the nobles in the north give up Ampere Seal." "You mean we still have to coexist peacefully with these people who are trying to usurp the throne? After annihilating the Canolia fleet, we can still take advantage of the situation and go north." Wood was already very clear about the way people like Brando acted. They must have considered the results before giving such an order, so he would not use the revenge of the Holy Cathedral of Fire as a false threat. It would be meaningless. He thought for a moment and said, "As you said, the royal family of Covardo should continue to hold the throne, but there are still many nobles in the north, and it will take time to calm their suspicions. It is better for Erwin to unite peacefully than to confront each other." Brando looked at the Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in surprise. He understood the meaning behind his words. Would meant to acknowledge the legitimacy of the royal family of Covardo, so that the north would have no actual basis to rely on, and the internal strife in the kingdom would disappear. But this was a little too easy. How could the Holy Cathedral compromise so thoroughly? It was not that the remaining forces in the north did not have the strength to fight against the princess. Even if they failed, Cruz's people could be very stubborn. Or was this another trap? He could not help but deeply suspect. "Mr. Brando, you don't have to suspect that this is another deception. I will tell you the reason, and you will understand as soon as you hear it. The reason is actually Moros." "Moros? You should know that he killed Princess Magadol." "No, wait," Brando suddenly reacted, and he thought of a very terrible possibility. "Wasn't Princess Magadol killed because she discovered your secret?" Wood's face was a little ugly. How could the Holy Cathedral do such a thing, not to mention that she did not know the Holy Cathedral's plan from beginning to end? The request for reinforcements from the Empire and the transfer of Williams from the headquarters was just a spur-of-the-moment idea after I read Moros's letter. No one else knew about it except Moros himself. In other words, Her Royal Highness discovered another secret? "I'm afraid so," Wood's face was dignified. "Mr. Brando, I'm afraid that Moros is a spy from All for One." Brando could not help but cry out. "So you opened the door of flame of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the port of Ampere-Seal?" He saw Wood looking at him seriously, and understood that there was no need to say more. At that moment, Brando felt as if a basin of cold water had been poured on his head. The situation was serious. He finally understood why Wood came to him to make peace. It turned out that the whole thing was a huge conspiracy. If Moros was a spy from All for One, then he knew early on that the Holy Cathedral of Fire would set up the door of flame in Ampere-Seal. He might even have been the one who guided it, because All for One's goal was those door of flame. The door of flame was a huge teleportation circle, and the core of the teleportation circle designated the destination of the teleportation. But the teleportation circle itself had no intelligence, and it could be used to connect to other places with slight modifications. For example, the Devil's Lair, the Sulphur River. Brando suddenly felt a chill down his spine. "Brando, the Roman said that she found a trap and she wanted to help you." That was the first thing Amandina said to him when they met. He thought she was talking about the Holy Cathedral's trap and was angry at her childishness. But at this moment he suddenly realized that Amandina might have known what she was going to face. She knew about the conspiracy that he did not know about. For the first time, Brando felt extremely uneasy, and even had the thought that he might lose the lovely person who always stood by his side fearlessly. Once this thought appeared, it could not be suppressed, and made him feel even colder as he stood in the rain. Since Butchie, Brando knew that at least one person in this world would be with him forever. He could pinch her face without restraint and call her an idiot, and she would frown at him and throw a tantrum. But he would never forget the promise, the words she said to him that night. "Why don't you go over?" Amandina seemed to still be sitting on the rock, holding her bag with both hands on her leather skirt, and a pair of round-toed leather shoes swinging back and forth in the air. "They don't like me. What? Auntie and I are weirdos in their eyes, and no ordinary girl wants to be a merchant. So it's normal that they don't like them. I've never seen them. Auntie has been by my side for as long as I can remember. Auntie said, 'Little Roman, when you grow up you have to repay Auntie. So that's why you want to be a merchant.'" Yes. What a strange idea. It doesn't matter. From that moment on, he knew that he had fallen deeply in love with that strange girl. That was because they had some similar characteristics. He was also a strange person in the eyes of others, but the two of them had the same goal. She wanted to be a great merchant and he wanted to save Erwin in his heart. These were strange goals that ordinary people could not imagine, but it didn't matter. As long as they agreed, it would be fine. Brando, Roman, she. Freya also reacted. This simple-minded girl from the countryside of Butchie had worried about her best friend even earlier than Brando. But Brendel gave her a reassuring look, although his heart was also cold. "Archbishop Wood, do you think that All for One can control those doors of flame?" he asked, still holding on to the last bit of hope. "Mr. Brando, there's no need to guess. We lost them before we came here. All for One connects them to the underground of Georgiandy Ridge, and you should know where that is. The Sulphur River. Brando replied through gritted teeth. So what am I supposed to do? Give the order to stop pursuing Canolia's fleet, and then turn around to fight the demons of Georgiandy Ridge here on Aween's soil? He could not help but curse. Look at what you've done, Kurlut's bastards. What bullshit, holy cathedral of fire. This was the first time Freya saw Brando so angry, and her face was pale with fright. The last time was in Fortress Reden, but she was not there. Well said, Mephistopheles replied. Now that's more like a man. Wood was speechless. It was an indisputable fact that the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and even the 4 holy cathedrals, had been infiltrated by the cultists. It was just that the situation had never been as out of their expectations as today. This time, the Holy Cathedral of Fire had really lost a lot of face. Even more than when Cruz's fleet was defeated by Brando. We will fight side by side with you. That was all he could say. Brando snorted softly. He did not trust these Cruz people at all. If he had known that Moros was all for one spy, then he might have guessed the other party's plan the moment he saw those portals. It was a pity that Moros missed this opportunity in history. There was no war in Ampere Seal, and Cruz's people did not build the Door of Flame in Erewhon until after his term. Later, Moros returned to Cruz, and Brando also went north to Saint Tassol and Fanzan. Later, some news about the Holy Cathedral of Fire gradually faded from his memory, and he would forever miss the opportunity to identify Moros. Well, Brando finally said, I will persuade Her Royal Highness to give up chasing the Canolian fleet, but you must also persuade the Northern Coalition Army to join our camp. If things are allowed to develop, you know better than me what will happen near Ampere Seal. He then pointed to Wood and said, I hope Lord Archbishop remembers what you said today, or you will regret your previous words and deeds. Brando's heart was burning with anger, but now he was only worried about the safety of Romain. If the Roman were to suffer even a little bit of damage in Ampere Seal, he would definitely make the Holy Cathedral of Fire pay the price. This was by no means an empty threat. When he turned around, Wood vaguely heard Brando mutter, I hope the number of demons sent by All for One is not too large. The Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire seemed to be stunned for a moment before he reacted. This young man seems to know too much? PS 4000. Also, thank you for the character form. I will use it as a blueprint to check it myself to make a character card. This will make it much easier for me. Thank you very much. Also, today I will put up the second group's log. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 6:18. The invasion of the demons quickly became the most serious situation at the moment, and everyone knew the weight of this news. Would hope that the princess could first release the captives of the Holy Cathedral of Fire and let the Canolian fleet recover at least some combat power to deal with the coming war with the demons. But Brando did not immediately respond to this request. Time was tight, but it did not mean that he needed to give up the previous victory. The war took a break and both sides needed to rest. The demons could not appear in front of them immediately. These creatures from the Sulphur River would also be hindered in the heavy rain. Before that, even in the worst-case scenario, he had more than 10 hours to negotiate with the Cruz people. Brando's request was very simple, but it was also a bit of an exorbitant demand. The Northern Coalition Army should return all the captives belonging to the princess, including His Royal Highness the Little Prince. After that, the Holy Cathedral of Fire had to bear all the losses caused by this war because Brando believed that the northern nobles started the war under their instigation. He did not care whether the truth was the case or not. This included the compensation and trade compensation agreement. Of course, the compensation was done privately in order to take care of the face of the Cruz people. Brando could still meet this small request. After all, he only focused on the practical benefits. The trade compensation agreement was a compensation method proposed by Brando. On the surface, it was a trade preference of the Cruz Empire for the Erewhon Empire. But in fact, there were many detailed conditions, including 2 important technology transactions. The drawings of the magic transmission device and the manufacturing technology of the Empire's Dreadnought-class battleship. This was simply blackmail. Seeing these 2 conditions, the expression on Wood's face was as dark as the dark clouds outside Ampere Seal. He did not say a word and just left. Then he sent an envoy to negotiate with Brando. The envoy simply claimed that if Brando did not cooperate, the Holy Cathedral would give up on Erewhon, and Cruz people would lose a little face at most. But the best outcome for Erewhon was a great loss of vitality, and the worst outcome was undoubtedly the destruction of the country. If these words were placed in front of other Erewhon nobles, it would undoubtedly be a huge bomb. Even the princess would be shaken by these words. However, Brando just smiled and ordered Mephistopheles to throw this guy out of the camp. What a joke. He was well aware of the Holy Sanctum's weakness. Cruz's people probably didn't just want to save face, but more importantly, the secret of the Door of Flame must not fall into the hands of All for One. He knew that there were several permanent doors of flame in the Cruz Empire. Once the secret of the Doors of Flame was leaked out, the Empire would become another gate from the Sulphur River to the surface world. With this secret in hand, Brando naturally wouldn't compromise easily. However, he also felt uneasy in his heart. If that old fox would really dare to bide his time, Brando was afraid that he would have to take the initiative to compromise with him. This was because only he, Amandina, and Freya knew that the Roman were still in the port of Ampere Seal. And once Cruz's people took the initiative, he was afraid that Erewhon would be skinned alive. Brando gritted his teeth and held on for an hour and a half. Finally, Wood couldn't help but come to the door. After all, the Archbishop didn't have any news that was enough to make him feel at ease. When Wood came, Brando breathed a sigh of relief. Cruz's people had given in. In just half an hour, Brando signed a temporary peace agreement with Wood, taking advantage of the momentum of Cruz's people giving in. Brando was not soft-hearted. In addition to the superficial agreement, the two sides signed a temporary secret agreement. The Holy Cathedral of Fire privately recognized the right of the royal family of Covardo to prosecute several major leaders of the northern nobles for usurpation in the future. This included the right to dispose of Duke Cipher, Marquis Balta, Count Vitokin, Marquis Yoakum, and others. However, this second clause was not brought to the surface. First of all, now was not the time to shake the confidence of the northern nobles. Second, the Archbishop had already discovered that Duke Cipher, Marquis Balta, Count Vitokin, and Marquis Yoakum were nowhere to be found. Presumably, His Royal Highness Prince Haruz had also fallen into the hands of All for One. Therefore, even if the Holy Cathedral wanted to fulfill this clause, they did not have the ability to do so for the time being. After meeting all the requirements, Brando naturally agreed in principle to return all the captives of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, including the 7 knights of the Holy Cathedral, the White-Winged Knight, and the other captives of the Canolia fleet. After all, these people would also play their role in the war and could be regarded as Brando's coolies. Although Cruz's people might not think so. At the same time, in exchange for a second, more important agreement, Brando also took a step back on the original technology transfer agreement and changed the latest type of magical transmission device to a blueprint that was not more than 10 years behind, and the battleship manufacturing technology was also changed to frigate manufacturing technology. But even so, Brando still left a trap. Because his original target, the Knight, was the design of the Cruz Empire's new frigate. The Cruz battleship pursued firepower and armor, which was cumbersome and unpleasant. He preferred the Wind Elves' new type of battleship, but the Cruz's new frigate was a design stolen from their old enemy, the Hazel people, but it was extremely brilliant. After all, the Hazel people were one of the best magicians in the world of Wand. Unfortunately, although Wood was a respected archbishop and the most talented senior of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, he was not a technocrat. Most of the nobles who followed the army of the Holy Cathedral of Fire were unlikely to bring along master craftsmen. So in the case where everyone was unaware of the trap, Brando naturally tricked them cleanly and ruthlessly. In the end, the two sides exchanged captives and reached a preliminary settlement. Brando did not intend to let the two armies that had just killed each other a few hours ago merge together to fight against the demons. This was undoubtedly a fantasy. So he simply let the Northern Coalition army stay in the Bunuo area, while the Princess's army and Anthony's army were directly stationed in the Mar Highlands. This proposal was also approved by everyone. Anyway, the northern nobles were not necessarily willing to stand in the same trench as Her Royal Highness. Then Brando blocked the news of the demon invasion and did not let any rumors spread among the ordinary soldiers. He only told them that there might be a foreign army from Georgandy Ridge invading Ampere Seal. Although it was frustrating to have to go back to the battle before they could celebrate after winning a big battle, it was better than having a large number of deserters immediately. He had seen similar scenes before during the Second and Third War of the Black Rose. Both Austin and the nobles of the royal faction agreed. They knew the virtue of their men. Although the royal faction had parted ways with Her Royal Highness earlier, the princess had said that she would let bygones be bygones, and the two sides were temporarily back on the same chariot. Due to the presence of Brando and Eek, Princess Griffine's status had improved a lot. But the morale of the soldiers was still a problem. Brando threw this problem to Cruz and asked Wood to persuade the nobles of the Northern Coalition army to mobilize supplies from the vicinity of Buñuel, at least to let Anthony and Count Austin's army celebrate a victory. As long as there is hot meat soup, even in this terrible weather, the ordinary soldiers will still be satisfied. Before evening, Brando had begun to send scouts to the periphery to get information about the vicinity of the port, as well as whether the port had fallen into the hands of the demons and the number of demons. But considering that the residents of the surface world knew little about the situation in the underground world, Brando decided to go in person and explore the vicinity of Ampere Seal. His risky action was naturally strongly opposed by Amandina, and even Princess Griffin did not quite agree with it. But he still decided to go ahead. It was just that he did not expect that Her Royal Highness could not stop him from taking the risk and insisted on going with him. She ordered Oberway to stay behind to pacify the soldiers, then changed into a knight's uniform, mounted a horse and joined his team. Count Austin went with her. Brando was naturally powerless to stop what Her Royal Highness wanted to do. Fortunately, he did not intend to fight with the demons. He just wanted to investigate the situation at the front line, so he let her be. Brando naturally would not think that Her Royal Highness was particularly concerned about him. Perhaps it was also because of this. But there were a few times when he saw the half-elf girl's bright silver eyes reflecting the rain, and he thought to himself that she must not be satisfied with her identity as a woman. Indeed, she was far more suitable for the throne than her brother. I just don't know if those cavemen will give us a night to rest. Count Austin replied with some uneasiness. Brando could understand Austin's uneasiness. Events like the demon invasion could be big or small, and it happened in the surface world all the time. For example, an evil sorcerer summoning a demon and forming a contract with it, or occasionally, a ferocious beast from the Sulphur River escaped to the surface. These events were not important. But once a situation like this happened where the demons controlled one or more large teleportation portals, it would be a serious matter. Because the demons themselves also had the technology to create teleportation portals. If the local lords did not react quickly and destroy the teleportation portals, the army of creatures in the lower world would snowball rapidly. In history, there were a few incidents where a country was destroyed. The earliest example was in the year of the Golden Hoof. Then it happened again in the year of glory. That unlucky duchy was very close to Erewhon, near the Duchy of Antiburo. I'm afraid not. Brando replied. The demons were not like Erewhon's wyvern cavalry. They could march well at night, but the heavy rain would also hinder their movements. The hillsides in the Black Pine Forest became slippery and difficult to walk on under the heavy rain, and the sky became a line at the end of the horizon. Fortunately, Brando was very familiar with the terrain in this area. The group bypassed a few short hills, and then a mountain peak appeared in their sight. This was Brando's goal. Under the protection of the night, he, the princess, and Count Austin climbed up the highest mountain closest to Ampere Seal in the rain. Then they looked down from the top of the mountain. The direction of the port was dark, which was one of the worst signs. He looked up and saw a few dark clouds floating from the north. Then he found that they were all harpies. They were close relatives of the sirens, but they were expelled in the Battle of Cairano and later hid in the underground world. Brando put down the binoculars in his hand and could not help but take a breath of cold air. He looked back and saw that Her Royal Highness was pale. As Wood had expected, there was already an army from Georgandy Ridge in the port of Ampere Seal. The three of them were silent for a while. Those don't seem to be demons? Her Royal Highness asked. Brando nodded. He glanced at the other two, but found that they did not seem to realize that there was a problem. The army of Georgandy Ridge was mixed in with the demons, which was not a good sign. There were not only cavemen in the underground world, but most of the surface residents were called cavemen. Few of them could distinguish the relationship between the demons and the other forces in Georgandy Ridge, so it was understandable that they showed such an attitude. But Brando knew that Georgandy Ridge was actually a general term. The underground world was crisscrossed and connected to many areas such as the Mushroom Field and the Eternal Dark Abyss. The Sulphur River where the demons lived was actually the lowest level of the core world, isolated by the elemental boundary of Wond. The first to discover them were the Dark Elves. The Dark Elves built a city on the lava plains, Scorching Tip. Due to the influence of the dark magic, the high-ranking nobles of the city quickly corrupted and destroyed the seal of the elemental boundary. The demons broke out of the box and the Dark Elven Empire disappeared. After that, the Dark Elves retreated into the Eternal Dark Abyss, and the demons quickly occupied a piece of land and became one of the original inhabitants of the underground world. However, the residents of the underground world were hostile to each other. The The Georgiandy Ridge Empire, which was controlled by the Black Dragon, would never surrender to the demons. How did the two races mix together? Brando remembered that the first time Georgiandy Ridge invaded the surface world in history was at the beginning of the Second Era, after the Second War of the Black Rose. That was the fourth chapter of the game, Eternal Dark. Could it be that there were some unknown changes in the underground world? It couldn't be. Brando didn't think that the history he changed would affect Georgiandy Ridge so quickly. The Howran Gaia was already a coincidence among coincidences. But in any case, the real problem still needed to be solved. Mr. Brando, what should we do now? Princess Griffin asked. There were so many harpies in the sky that they looked like a dark cloud. She never dreamed that such a large army would gather near Ampere Seal in just one day. The number of demons on the ground could be imagined. This was a force that even Anthony's army and the Northern Coalition army together could not resist. Brando also looked at this scene and was silent for a moment. I don't have any good ideas. Mr. Brando, you don't have any ideas? Princess Griffin was almost speechless. Brando nodded. All for One's move was indeed beyond his expectations. The demon army now was almost more than the previous Holy Cathedral of Fire and the Northern Coalition army combined, and he no longer had the ability to start the cycle of the Paradise of Adversity again in a short time. Summoning the Holy Cathedral of Life, the Adversity Trojan Horse, and all the pre-cycles, he had to accumulate elements for a long time. At least he didn't have to think about it for a week. He pursed his lips tightly, and for a moment his mind was full of thoughts about the current situation. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 6:19. Dark clouds gathered in the north, and the port of Ampere Seal was pitch black. However, outside the port, there was a sea of sparks, as if lava was flowing all over the ground. That was the characteristic of the Devil's Charred Land. The portal obviously connected the Sulphur River and Erewhon together, and the two sides overlapped. On the charred land, the transformed portal emitted a scarlet color, which was clearly visible from this direction, like agate scattered on a black velvet carpet. The scene was like the end of the world, and everyone could not help but hold their breath. Brando listened to the princess's question and lowered his head to think of a solution. But at this time, the dark clouds in the sky suddenly changed direction. The princess and the others were slightly startled and felt that something was wrong. The knight could not help but look at each other, and then subconsciously looked at the young lord beside them. After all, none of them had actually seen the creatures of Georgiandy Ridge, and the one who seemed to be the most knowledgeable was undoubtedly the Lord of Trentheim. Brando came back to his senses. He raised his head and noticed the change in the sky. His face suddenly changed and he shouted, "Quick, cover the reflective things on your body with a cloak." The harpies had an extremely wide field of vision and were very sensitive to light. They also liked to collect shiny things to decorate their nests, which was similar to their winged counterparts. And for the same reason they could easily catch faint reflections dozens of miles away, which made them excellent scouts. It was obvious that someone's armor reflected lightning that caught their attention. It was also a moment of carelessness that he forgot to mention it to the others. It was probably because he saw the army of Georgiandy Ridge earlier, and his mind was distracted for a moment. Everyone hurriedly wrapped their armor with their cloaks, and then fastened the laces on their collars. However, it seemed that it was a little too late. When they raised their heads, they saw that a few dark clouds in the northern sky had already begun to move southward. Those strange creatures with pairs of wings spread out in groups in the sky, and in the blink of an eye, they had already swarmed over in an overwhelming manner. Brando looked back and saw that everyone's faces were completely pale, and Princess Griffin was no exception. There were only 17 of them in total, while there were tens of thousands of harpies on the other side. One of the knight even unsheathed his sword subconsciously. Brando was startled and rushed over to stop him. "Don't move. They haven't discovered us yet," he shouted loudly, afraid that someone would pull out their sword in a panic. Once the reflection of the blade was emitted, everything would be too late. "Quick, find a place to hide." Brando knew the habits of harpies very well. These cautious creatures must have come to check after attracting attention. They liked to move in groups, but they might not have really discovered them. After all, this place was still more than 10 miles away, and the harpies might not be able to detect even the slightest movements in the forest. But the night had already lost their minds. Brando's words became their only hope. They all retreated to the back of the black pine forest and found a place to hide. Brando pulled the princess to hide under a huge rock. This gray-white rock stretched across the top of the mountain and was covered with moist moss. Brando first settled the princess down, then guarded the entrance of the cave. He raised his head and found Count Audine hiding behind a rock opposite him, shouting at him, "Don't worry, Count Audine. Horses." Brando then remembered that everyone's horses were still at the foot of the mountain. He suddenly had a headache, but it was obviously unrealistic to rush down the mountain now. He could only hope that Martha would prevent the harpies from discovering the war horses. In just a few minutes, the harpies had already arrived. The sound of flapping wings passed over his head, letting him know that the winged creatures were close by. His heart pounded, but Brando did not dare to stretch his head out to look. He looked back and saw Princess Griffin sitting at the side looking at him. Although she looked a little nervous, her eyes were calm when she looked at him. "Don't worry," he mouthed to her. Princess Griffin nodded gently, one hand on the hilt of her sword. He looked up again and saw that Count Audine's face was also pale. The two of them looked at each other and could not help but smile bitterly. He knew that he was not much better. He dared to fight Williams because he had Kelsey's deck of cards in hand. But now, there were 17 people facing thousands of harpies, and there were 10 times that number in the distance. Even if he was drowned, he would still be drowned. But fortunately, although the harpies were very sensitive to light, their eyesight was extremely ordinary. Moreover, they were very cautious creatures and would definitely not descend below the canopy to check. Brando, who knew this in his heart, was slightly relieved. But it was at this moment that his heart throbbed. It was like his heart suddenly skipped a beat, feeling that someone was spying on his secrets. The others were fine, but the experienced Brando immediately realized what it was. Magic. Detection magic. He was sure that there was a pair of malicious eyes inspecting this place through the crystal ball, and the demon warlocks in blood-red robes that came from under the Sulphur River were the best at this. Her Royal Highness beside him turned pale, and her weak body trembled as if she had also sensed something. Brando subconsciously felt that something was wrong, and immediately reminded her, "Quick, don't think about anything that you are most worried about now. Think about what to eat tonight, the annoying carrot stew or oatmeal." The half-elf girl's silver eyes looked at him in confusion. "This is a demon spell, black magic. It will affect your mind and see the answer it wants to know through your mind. The more afraid you are, the more negative emotions accumulate, and the more it can see what you are most afraid of now. That will expose our position." "But I don't hate carrot stew," Princess Griffin replied with a little grievance. "That's impossible." Brando was stunned. But regardless of whether it was possible or not, just as the two of them were a little relieved, a scream suddenly came from the distance in the rain. Someone was discovered. Brando's heart went cold. He should have let everyone hide together. After all, he was the only one here who had experience in avoiding detection spells. "Mr. Brando," Her Royal Highness whispered. Brando's hand clenched the hilt of Howran Gaia for a moment. Should he rush out now? The harpies were just upper silver-ranked monsters, and the knights he brought were all at the peak of silver-ranked. If he rushed out now, he might be able to save the other party's life. But what about Her Royal Highness? If he made a move, could he lead these people to kill their way out of the thousands of harpies? Brando had no confidence at all. But he immediately felt cold fingers on the back of his hand. "Mr. Brando, I understand your thoughts, thank you," Princess Griffin said softly, "but no matter what, please don't go against our ideals and pursuits. This is the value of our existence." She nodded to him. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He suddenly understood why when Orthless warned him to be careful of the princess, he did not take it seriously. Princess Griffin had never changed. If she had chosen to compromise, she would not have broken with the royal faction. In the face of ideals and reality, she had always been the holy princess. Brendel had never seen a person who could combine wisdom and conviction into a single person. Before that, the players of Erewhon had never seen such a person. He made up his mind. He raised his sword and rushed out, only to be met by a harpy that immediately swooped down on him from the sky. Her beautiful female head had blood-red eyes that flashed with a venomous light. She opened her sharp claws and slashed at him like 8 knives. Brando was not in a hurry. He pursed his lips and took a step back. He pulled out Howran Gaia with both hands and swung it upwards. The blade immediately cut off a pair of claws. The harpy who lost her balance screamed and fell backward. Her head hit the trunk of a black pine tree and her brain splattered. Brando then saw the knight who was caught. He was not in a good situation. He was surrounded by 7 or 8 harpies. Without a second thought, he raised his hand and shot a wind bullet in that direction. The wind bullet spun and brushed past the treetops, hitting the 2 harpies squarely. Instantly, the harpies' wings were torn apart and blood rained down. The sudden attack frightened the harpies, and they all scattered while screaming strangely. The knight finally found a chance to breathe. He turned back and looked at Brando gratefully. "You shouldn't have come out, my lord." He smiled. "I don't want to be a coward like those northerners. You are from the royal faction, right?" Brando saw that the other party was from Lantern Island. "Yes." Brando nodded and shouted, "I heard that the royal faction never leaves their companions. If that's the case, everyone, why don't you listen to my orders and face the enemy head-on? Today we will kill our way out. These monsters can't stop us." The knight was excited and couldn't help but agree. They all pulled out their long swords and quickly gathered together. Now everyone was exposed to the sight of the harpies. They screamed in the air, but the power of Brando's wind bullet made these cautious creatures not dare to try again. Brando reached out to help the princess. In his impression, this strong-willed princess would stand up on her own. But this time, Princess Griffin put her hand in his and smiled politely at him. Then she used his strength to stand beside him. "Thank you, Mr. Brando," she said softly. Brando heard unreserved trust in this sentence. The harpies began their second round of attack. They fell like raindrops. Brando hurriedly led the knight to retreat. Behind them was a dense forest. The canopy of the black pine forest naturally blocked the attack of the harpies. But sooner or later they would attack them through the layers of branches. Brando knew that he had to find a way to get down the mountain and back to the horse. The harpies were good at fighting in the air. Their specialty was flexibility, but they were not outstanding in speed and endurance. He had to find a way to get rid of them. The harpies had already descended from the treetops. Brando looked up and saw that their claws were sharp. They grabbed onto the tree trunks tightly and jumped forward. They were not any slower than flying, and in a few moments they were above Brendel's head. This scene was very similar to the first time he fought with these feathered beasts in the wetland forest near Grey Haven. He subconsciously shouted, "Shoot them down. Try to shoot them in the back." The knight immediately took out the short bows and four-armed crossbows from their waists and aimed at the monsters. The harpies were terrifyingly agile. They circled left and right between the tree trunks. Almost all the arrows that were shot missed. But the knight soon found the trick. They found that the harpies liked to extend a distance when dodging. With Brando's reminder, the knight in the second round of attack calculated the distance behind the monsters. This time, more than half of the harpies were shot. The knight was excited. "My lord, how did you know?" "Knowledge is power. The answers to the world are in the scrolls," Brando said casually. This sentence sounded like an enigmatic wizard. The knight immediately showed a look of awe. But this sentence also reminded the princess of the knowledge that Fleetwood had taught her. Wisdom sharper than swords is hidden in the scrolls. This was an ancient proverb in Cruz. It was said that the mages all believed in the same idea. Her hand was tightly held by Brando. She ran forward with all her might, but her heart was calm. She thought to herself, "Mr. Knight is indeed a Danny Lean. He admires the knowledge of the Highland mages so much." At this time, Brando noticed that the experience points of the harpies killed by the knight were also counted to him. One harpies gave him 60 experience points. This was obviously the result of the calculation of the penalty for teaming up and the level penalty. But the harpies he killed alone only gave him about 90 experience points. This amount of experience points was nothing to him at the moment. But the key point was that it further confirmed his previous speculation about teaming up. It seemed that as long as they were on the same side, they would be in the same party as him. He just did not know the upper limit of the distance. The group had now passed through half of the forest. More and more harpies were climbing down from the tree trunks in all directions. They did not dare to stop and rest for a moment. If they were even a little slower, they would be surrounded. Previously, a moment of carelessness had already caused two knights to be dragged out. One could imagine the fate that awaited them. Seeing that the end of the forest was approaching, there was an open space outside. It was at least 100 meters wide. When they passed through there, the harpies would obviously launch the fiercest siege. In fact, Brando already had some harpies hovering in the sky over there. "Brando, what do we do next?" Obviously, Count Audine had also noticed the predicament that they were about to face. But Brando looked around and was at his wits' end. Almost none of the cards in his hand were suitable. Even if there were, they lacked elements. He had already summoned the Black Wolf once. He only had the giant King Bunny's concealment cloak to escape this disaster. But Bunny's concealment cloak could only accommodate 10 people, and it could only last for less than 5 minutes. "Everyone hold hands and charge together. Be careful not to be dragged out." Brando activated conflicting aura, and a pale yellow aura array immediately spread out from his body. Most of the knights recognized the signature skill of this Knight of the Templar and understood what he was going to do. Now it seemed that they could only brace themselves and charge out. Brando looked outside the forest and decided to cast a mist spell or a similar spell first. Anyway, he had the level of an elementalist. Mist spell was just a level 2 spell, so it was not difficult for him. The only trouble was that he was still wearing armor when he was running, so the failure rate of casting the spell was frighteningly high. Brando tried 3 times in a row before he finally cast the spell. Mist spell was actually just to create a hazy mist. This spell was very effective in defending against the enemy's accurate long-range attacks. Brando wanted to use this spell to prevent the harpies from taking advantage of their numbers. But he did not expect that the moment he cast the spell, an unexpected scene would happen. It was not mist that emerged in the open space, but a dark cloud. This dark cloud seemed to cover the entire hillside in the blink of an eye, and the surroundings were plunged into darkness. What's going on? The knight suddenly fell into a panic. Brando was also shocked. This was not a mist spell. Fortunately, it was not the first time he fought in the dark. In the game, he had to be prepared to deal with all kinds of dark spells when he fought against the Lich of Madara. Brando was still calm. He subconsciously grabbed the princess' hand to make sure that the wizard who cast the spell was not targeting the most important target beside him. At the same time, he held his breath and listened to the sounds around him. The sound of rain in the distance was loud, but in the rain, there were the same panicked cries of the harpies. It seemed that the newcomer was not an enemy. At least it was not a demon warlock. He was a little relieved, but it was at this time. He felt an old voice in his mind. Please come with me, my king. Do not care about the dangers around you. Go north, I'll wait for you there. Brando was slightly stunned. Who are you? How can I trust you? He asked in his mind. Use your heart to feel. The darkness is no secret in front of you. You should be able to feel that I have no evil intentions. Brando took a light breath. He did not have a premonition of danger. The other party obviously wanted to help him in this situation, but he still had to be careful. He hesitated for a moment before saying to everyone around him, "Everyone listen to me. Hold hands and follow me." Then he reached out and pulled Count Audine on the other side. Everyone held hands together. Brando did not know which direction was north, but he vaguely felt that one direction was safer, so he subconsciously walked in that direction step by step. Sure enough, after a few minutes, the screams of the harpies in the dark were getting farther and farther away. Everyone could not help but let out a sigh of relief. After all, no one wanted to die if they could. Because of that, the knight could not help but feel grateful to Brando for helping them escape. "Mr. Brando," Princess Griffin's voice came from behind him, "is this your magic?" "No, I don't know," Brando replied. In fact, he did not have any confidence. He had already opened a spiritual link in his mind and began to contact the Shire on the other side. God knows if this was another trap, but he had to be safe. "The Shire, you damned bastard, can you hear me?" In the pine forest, the students had temporarily built a camp to shelter from the rain. A wooden wall was built with pine wood, and a waterproof canvas was propped up on both sides to form a simple tent. In the tent, Makarov and the rest of the royal faction were in a cold war with Oberwei. It seemed like the royal faction was about to break off relations with the princess again, but those who were here all along knew that it was just a disagreement over the next battle plan. Oberwei supported Brando's idea and thought that it was better to divide the defense area with the Northern Alliance temporarily. Makarov did not trust the nobles in the north at all. In his opinion, the Northern Alliance could be the main force in Cruz's army to defend against the Devil's attack, while the nobles would attack the Devils from the flanks. The parchment map, which had been drawn countless times, was now placed on the wooden table. Amandina and Countess Yenbao Dilfrey were whispering to each other. The two of them were not interested in the nobles' battle plan. Dilfrey looked down on the royal faction, while Amandina only had absolute trust in Brando. Naturally, she was not interested in the nobles' suggestions. However, the fatigue on Amandina's face was obvious, and she did not let out a yawn. Makarov and Oberwei seemed to be natural enemies. The two of them had different opinions on the future of the royal faction, and now they had different opinions on how to cooperate with the Northern Alliance. Fortunately, they were aware of the current situation and did not start a fight. Otherwise, the cunning fox and the lone wolf of the kingdom would have to duel again. The older generation of the kingdom's nobles might still remember the last time they dueled. That was when they were young, but that was for their beloved lady. This time it was for their ideals and beliefs. Just as they were about to speak again, Charles walked in from the outside. He glanced at everyone in the tent and said, Let's go back to our camp. My lord is in trouble. Everyone was stunned. Alright, it's like this. Her Highness and my lord were discovered by the harpies of Jorgandi Ridge, and they are currently surrounded by the devils. The Shire had to explain again. What did you say? P.S. 6,000 words. Speaking of which, there was a small bug yesterday. I changed the 4th chapter of the game into the 3rd chapter. The first 4 chapters of the Amber Sword are, Chapter 1, The Birth of All Things, The Rise of Madara. Chapter 2, War and Chaos, The War Between the Holy Temples. Chapter 3, Ancient Legacy, The Excavation of the Slate and the Beginning of the Slate War. Chapter 4, Eternal Darkness, The Beginning of the Great Demonic Tide. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 620. At the same time when Brendel's party was attacked, the Kurlut's defense line was dark and heavy rain was pouring down. Sir Hawthorne rode his war dragon through the forest with his monk soldiers. What the hell? He grumbled in a low voice. Lucky for those Aween people to be able to endure this weather, it's enough for us. The monk soldiers laughed in a low voice. Hawthorne was from the warm northern foothills of Cruz Mount Merlan. He was very uncomfortable with the damp and cold of Ampere Seal in this season. The dragon under the saddle was more than 3 meters tall, and the iron armor on its body weighed half a ton. It was the most common mount for heavy cavalry in this era. With every step it took, the ground seemed to tremble slightly, leaving a mud pit several inches deep in the muddy woodland. The reason why they were here was because they received a report that a corvette of the Canolia fleet was attacked by strange creatures on the way back after the Erewhon Royal Fleet stopped attacking. However, the dragon cavalry of the Erewhon Northern Coalition Army did not find any trace of the corvette in the relevant airspace, so it was their turn to send their ground troops. Hawthorne was willing to bet that the corvette must have crashed. The group passed through the forest, and a burning wreckage of a warship appeared in front of them. The once majestic war machine was now only a broken frame, broken masts and sails were scattered on the ground, and even many cables were still hanging on the nearby branches. This is the corvette that was reported to have been attacked and crashed. What a huge thing. Sir Hawthorne couldn't help but think. Oh my god, it's the bull shark. Someone recognized the corvette and couldn't help but cry out in surprise, who on earth made it look like this? I think we'll know soon. Sir Hawthorne suddenly raised his head and pulled out his sword. There's an enemy, get ready to fight. Following his roar, everyone saw a pink monster suddenly crawling out from the wreckage of the warship. The monster climbed up the fallen mast and quickly reached the broken part. It was a giant monster that looked like both a bat and a humanoid creature. It was about 2 to 3 meters tall, and its forelimbs were more developed than its hind limbs. Its upper arms were muscular and it had a bull-like head on its neck. It also had a nose ring. It's a devil, a reckless devil. Someone with sharp eyes called out the monster's name at a glance. Demons were one of the archenemies of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The soldier monks had seen images of these demons in various scrolls and books. Spread out. Sir Hawthorne reacted faster than they did. The brute devils were the main air force of the Sulphur River. Young brute devils had the strength of a pinnacle silver rank, and once they reached adulthood, they would have the strength of a beginner gold rank. And the brute demon in front of Sir Hawthorne had already grown long horns. It was clearly a genuine adult brute demon overlord. Brute demon overlords, like many other demons, had the innate ability to control flames. They had several flame spell-like abilities. The fireball spell was one of them. With a flash of fire, a ball of flame had already exploded in the formation of the soldier monks of Cruz's Holy Cathedral of Fire, and several young soldier monks suddenly turned into flaming men. After releasing the fireball, the brute demon overlord let out a roar on the broken mast, as if it was enjoying the pleasure of killing. Damn demon. Sir Hawthorne couldn't help but be furious. He immediately ordered the war dragon to speed up. The brute demon overlord flapped its wings and flew up from the ship, flying into the air and throwing fireballs at him one after another. But Sir Hawthorne was not afraid. It was as if he was walking through the flames, and when he got close enough, he took a short spear from behind him and threw it forward. The soldier monks only saw a straight golden line fly out from Sir Hawthorne's hand, and the next moment, it hit the brute demon overlord in the sky. It was a special magic spear of the Holy Cathedral. The spearhead had been sanctified and was the natural enemy of demons. When the short spear hit the wings of the brute demon overlord, it was like a drop of water rolling into boiling oil. With a crash, a blazing white flame burned fiercely. The brute demon overlord screamed and fell from midair, hitting the broken mast of the warship. Its head was immediately separated from its body, and its spine was pulled a few meters away from its muscles. It couldn't be more dead. The soldier monks were stunned for a moment before they let out a cheer in unison. Hawthorne also breathed a sigh of relief. He turned his head, and in his heart he probably already knew what the attack on the bullshark was that caused it to crash. It seemed that Archbishop Wood's guess was right. The demons had invaded Erewhon on a large scale. The demons lacked an advanced air force, and the brute demon overlord was already one of the best elite flying troops under the Sulphur River. But it was at this time that he suddenly heard someone scream, "What is that?" Sir Hawthorne was startled and subconsciously turned his head to follow the voice. He felt that the sky seemed to brighten slightly. The layers of dark clouds in that direction parted, and a flaming meteorite fell from the sky and fell in a certain direction. Then, as if it was a copy of this scene, the black clouds rolled as if boiling and countless fiery red spots appeared behind the separated clouds. Then meteorites tore through the dark clouds and fell, and for a time half of the sky was reflected in a blood-red color. Sir Hawthorne was completely stunned. He had already estimated that the meteors were falling in the direction of the main position of the Northern Coalition Army. It's over. His heart was cold. He saw with his own eyes a meteor hit the Perrin in the distance in midair. The Kurlut's flagship turned into ashes in a dazzling light at that time. At that moment, Sir Hawthorne even forgot that the captain of the Canolia fleet was still on the flagship. In fact, he had lost the ability to think at all. There was no magic array in the sky. This was the curse of the demons. It should be the top 14 circle spell, Doomsday. A high-grade demon of the Lord level entered the portal. This was the only thought left in his mind. What did you say? Where are they now? Makarov and Oberway spoke at the same time, but they did not have time to continue. Suddenly, a bright light flashed outside the camp, and a cry of alarm came from outside the tent. Half of the sky outside the tent seemed to have lit up. Something big had happened. Everyone was shocked. The Shire was the first to react and turned to open the tent door. Then, the red-haired girl who had been silent all this time rushed out from beside him, followed by Amandina. Makarov and Oberway looked at each other and followed out. Once they walked out of the tent, everyone suddenly lost the ability to speak. In their field of vision, they could only see that the sky in the northwest was brightly lit. Countless meteors fell from the sky like rain, crashing to the ground. Makarov quickly calculated that the direction was Bunyuo. The demons have begun to attack the Northern Coalition Army. He immediately came to a conclusion. That's Doomsday. The enemy has an ultimate wizard. Oberway sucked in a breath of cold air. It's a demon lord Martha above. This time, there will be an entire demon army, more than the last time recorded in history. Everyone knew which time he was talking about. That time, a kingdom similar in size to Erewhon was completely destroyed and turned into scorched earth. Under the demon's rampage, millions of lives were completely wiped out. In fact, it was no longer a war but a massacre and disaster. It was a scar in the history of Wone that would never be erased. But this time, it seemed that it was the ancient kingdom of Oween's turn. What did Erewhon's people do wrong to deserve such a punishment? Everyone could not help but have this thought in their minds. But the kingdom's lone wolf was the first to react. Makarov. He yelled. I know, Oberway, I made a mistake. Makarov also suddenly realized his mistake. Although he originally wanted the Northern Coalition Army to be cannon fodder, he suddenly realized that he had misjudged the strength of the demons. The situation now was very clear. If the two sides did not unite, neither side would be able to fight against such an army of demons. In fact, even if they united, there was little hope. We must immediately find a way to support the Northerners. Makarov gritted his teeth. After the spell, the demons will definitely launch a ground attack. The Northerners and Cruz's people will definitely not be able to hold on. Once they retreat, Erewhon will be finished. Oberway nodded, but his heart was filled with anger. This was all done by Cruz and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. He finally understood why Brando was so angry and did not even give the Holy Cathedral any face and ruthlessly extorted a large sum of money from them. Now that he thought about it, if it was him, it would be great if he did not break off relations with the Holy Cathedral on the spot. But what about the Lord and Her Highness? Amandina suddenly said, they are still surrounded by the demons. Oberway and Makarov were stunned. They seemed to have forgotten about this problem. Where are they now? Did Brando say anything? Oberway asked. According to the Lord, they should be in the mountains near the west of Mt. Marchenko. The Harpies have sealed off their retreat, and they have no choice but to retreat to the north. The Lord ordered us to send the royal fleet to support the princess and open a path for them. The Shire said. I already said that they should not have put themselves in danger. Makarov snorted in annoyance. Her Highness also has her own temperament. She should have expected this situation. Look at this, the demons are attacking us, and we have to think of a way to save them when we are barely able to defend ourselves? But other than Brando, who else here is more familiar with Georgandy Ridge? The princess is willing to put herself in danger. This is a noble action. Makarov, I thought you were just brainless, but I didn't expect you to give up the honor of being a noble. The kingdom's lone wolf sneered. What did you say? That's enough, stop arguing. Amandina stood up and interrupted the two of them. Her brows were furrowed into a knot. What else did the Lord say? She asked the Shire. She felt that Brando was not someone who would give orders so rashly. Actually, the Lord has other plans. He wants us to inform Archbishop Wood and let Cruz cooperate with us. The Shire said. What does he want to do? Makarov raised his eyebrows and looked sharply at the young wizard. What does he want to do? Wood also wanted to know. The demons had already launched an attack on the Bunyuo region. To put it nicely, the Northern Alliance was retreating, but it was just a sign of collapse. This was an army that had already been defeated, and they had already lost their morale. Now it was the Holy Cathedral of Fire that was holding on, but they also suffered heavy casualties under the attack of doomsday spells. Canolia's fleet was almost completely wiped out. Admiral Earl Robbins and the Perrin sank together, and more than half of the White Wing Knight Regiment were killed. A large number of high-grade demons appeared in the battlefield, and even more dangerous was that an army of Georgandy Ridge was also fighting with the demons. The first to discover this information was a group of stone statues of the Northern Alliance's mountain infantry that the scouts found on the battlefield. It was obviously not a sculpture but a masterpiece of Medusa. Cruz can only hold on for 3 more hours. After half a day we will lose the last soldier. And you should know what the Northern Alliance is like. A holy knight replied to the young wizard in front of him. We need support. Wood actually knew the other party, the famous young wizard of the Pilus family, the Shire. We can support you. In fact, our army is already on the way. But after that, we still can't stop the demons' attack. You know our situation. The Shire replied. The holy knight couldn't help but be silent. So how long can we hold on? Wood asked. 1 day at most. Can we still open another door of flame and ask for support from the headquarters of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? The Shire asked. That's impossible, we don't have enough materials on hand. A holy knight retorted, it's not a simple matter to build a portal. Wood pondered for a moment and asked, so what does your lord think? The Shire nodded, in that case we may still have a chance left. A chance? Brando finally led the remaining 12 Lantern Island Knight out of the pervasive black fog. When they saw the surrounding scenery, they found that they were already in a valley in the north. The valley was cloudy with rain and fog, and not far ahead was an open space in the forest. On the green grass in the open space, there was a group of erect horses eating grass with their heads down. If they were not mistaken, those were the war horses they thought they had lost earlier. Count Audine and Her Royal Highness followed him on his left and right. They were so surprised by the strange scene in front of them that they were speechless. Oh my God, what the hell is going on? The knight couldn't help but exclaim. Although Her Royal Highness didn't ask, she also cast a puzzled look at Brando. Since Brando could lead them to get rid of the harpies and walk out of the black fog, he should naturally know what the mystery behind all this was. But Brando was also carefully observing the surroundings. The whole valley was shrouded in the sound of the rain, and the surrounding scenery didn't look much different from other places in the Erect Mountains. But he had a subtle feeling in his heart at the moment. May I ask who helped? He couldn't help but ask. Everyone saw a stooped old woman in a black robe suddenly walk out of the forest. When she saw Brando, she bowed respectfully. Her trembling movements made people think that she would fall at any time. Brendel, however, was shocked. It's you. He had already recognized this wrinkled old woman as the old witch Babasha that he had blackmailed in Fortress Reeden, but he never dreamed that he would meet her here. P.S. It's already the 18th of November. Time flies, it's been almost 2 months without a day off. My performance is not bad, right? I'm looking for a vote while I'm at it. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 621. Just as the demons were fighting Erwin's Northern Coalition army and the army of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, in the quiet port of Ampere Seal, the army of Georgandy Ridge quickly occupied the entire port. The coast guards had long been beaten to a pulp by Brando, but these creatures from the underground took advantage. Under the guidance of All for One, they easily opened the city gates and dispersed the remaining coast guards. By nightfall, there was only minimal resistance left in the entire port. In the torrential rain, a graceful figure was slowly going up the spiral stairs of the city tower. Medusa Lysimachia was wearing a white linen robe, revealing her bronze-colored, scaly skin. Her legs were far more slender than those of a human woman. However, she liked to wear her coin-patterned python-like tail on her shoulders, which looked like a shawl. She climbed to the rooftop of the city tower, separated the chattering harpies, and saw the dying Viscount Benninger. She picked up his wrist and chanted a word. A circle of black patterns faintly appeared on the third joint of the Viscount's left index finger. She carefully observed it next to her beautiful prismatic eyes before looking up and asking, "Where did you find him?" The harpies replied in a shrill voice in the unique language of the underground, "Nearby, madam." "Why hasn't the messenger woken up?" "The messenger has been knocked unconscious, madam." Humans are so fragile. Lysimachia was full of disdain. However, she did not dare to show this emotion. This person was an important figure of All for One. All for One was a believer of the Twilight Dragon and worked closely with the demons. It was not something that could be evaluated by lowly people like her. She lowered her head and stuck out her forked tongue to make a black mark on Viscount Benninger's forehead. Then, with a gentle stroke of her hand, she created a cover for him to block the rain. "Let's wait for Lord Brooke to come. Take good care of him. Our enemy this time is the terrible Holy Cathedral of Fire. The Lords still need All for One to unearth that instrument for them. As long as we have a firm foothold, we can have a wider land." Lysimachia seemed to yearn for it. Her beautiful long snake-like hair was raised and she hissed and flicked her tongue. She looked at the erect mountains in the distance. The undulating shadows of the mountains were shrouded in gloomy dark clouds. Her beautiful eyes reflected the color of lightning, as if some kind of spark had been ignited. But not far from her, in a leeward place, two ladies were having a serious discussion. "White Mist, we were right to leave Viscount Benninger there. We've caught a big fish. They're definitely up to something. All for One would not appear here otherwise. So what? Do you plan to follow her?" White Mist looked at her from the corner of her eyes. "Of course." Roman nodded matter-of-factly. "With your clumsy tracking skills, we'll be discovered in less than a minute. Then you'll be captured and killed. If that's the case, I'll have to die too." White Mist calmly attacked her. Roman couldn't help but show a dissatisfied look. His small eyebrows quickly raised. "Is it that bad?" "It's worse than that." "Then we'll have to give up on this plan." White Mist, what do we do next?" The merchant lady very casually rejected the plan that she had thought of for a long time. It was as if she wasn't the one who came up with the plan. "Think about it yourself." White Mist replied lazily. "I know. Brando won't be afraid of enemies on the surface, but it's hard to guard against conspiracies. That's what the night novel says. Besides, Brando looks stupid and easy to fool. We have to dig up the thing that they're going to dig up before they do." Roman immediately came to a new conclusion. "What do you plan to do?" White Mist felt that using Knight's novel as a model for action was a textbook example of what not to do. But this judgment was correct and she was too lazy to argue. To be honest, if she could, she wouldn't even bother to speak. "Let's go find those sneaky guys first," Roman replied confidently. "Sneaky guys? I saw Duke Erect just now. Didn't that Viscount say that they were also members of that association?" "Next time, please tell me this earlier." White Mist finally rolled her eyes weakly. This was the first time she made an expression today. "It's you, Babasha?" Brando already recognized this wrinkled old woman as the old witch Babasha that he blackmailed in Fortress Reedon. "A witch? Brando, who is she?" Princess Griffin was the first to react. Because they used to follow the Darkness Dragon, witches didn't have a good reputation in the human world, so most of them lived in seclusion. They were shrouded in a halo of evil, mystery, and ulterior motives. Many bedtime stories in Wand used them as the typical bad humans. Princess Griffin, who grew up in such a cultural atmosphere, was no exception. She only frowned, which showed that she had good self-restraint. Of course, one of the reasons was because the other party helped them once. Not only the princess but Count Audine also raised his eyebrows slightly. But as a mature noble, he was obviously more shrewd and didn't show the surprise in his heart on his face. "It's me, my lord." She was wearing a long black robe, and her wrinkled face was hidden under a wizard's hat. She bowed respectfully to Brendel. "Everyone, please do not worry. My lord has helped this old woman once, and I have sworn an oath in front of the darkness dragon that I will repay your kindness. Today I'm here to repay his kindness. My lord, please don't take it to heart." Baba Shah looked at everyone with her small eyes and replied. This was obviously a lie. When did he help her? It was more like blackmailing her. But Brando could more or less guess why she helped him. Soon, a voice in his heart confirmed this guess. "My lord, don't be confused. We are your loyal followers. At this juncture where history is about to change, the witches of the Winter Kingdom will first fulfill their promise." Sure enough, when Baba Shah predicted that he would bring the return of the darkness dragon in Fortress Reeden, he only thought it was ridiculous. However, the affairs of the world were unpredictable. Later on he really did become the successor of Odin's inheritance. However, he only obtained a fraction of this inheritance. In fact, he couldn't be considered the real dark dragon. He had no idea how this old witch found him. At this time there was another cold snort. "Brando, where did you provoke these dirty allies? Do you really want to be the darkness dragon?" This was the voice of the Wind Empress. Brando was shocked. He didn't expect the Wind Empress to speak at this time. She and Odin were sworn enemies. In other words, she was also one of the great enemies of these witches. He hurriedly looked up, but found that there was no strange expression on Babasha's face. Only then did he feel relieved. It seemed that Babasha's voice was just a magic effect. She couldn't pry into his thoughts. She obviously came to me. What does it have to do with me? Brando couldn't help but answer with grievance. If you're on your own, don't be complacent. The Wind Empress coldly dropped a sentence and didn't say anything again. Brando's heart moved. Madam Wind Empress, I thought you really wouldn't see me today. You, the Elf Queen gritted her teeth and cursed the pig Brando 10 times in her heart. Then she made up her mind that this time she would never pay attention to this guy until the last moment. Brando didn't realize that he had once again greatly offended the Wind Elves' ancestors. If he could, he would have been burned at the stake in the Wind Emperor's holy temple. Baba Shah, how do you know all this? He asked. The old witch smiled mysteriously. Master, you don't have to hide it. As long as the contract on the Black Prophecy has not disappeared, we witches can read all the secrets from it. The Black Prophecy has already predicted everything today. The Dark Dragon will return to the earth. The Black Prophecy also said that Madara will rule the earth, and the 12 branches of the witches will move towards unification. Isn't that just a matter of time? Brando criticized in his heart. However, he didn't want to get involved with these people. Witches didn't have a good reputation in the mortal world. Getting involved with them was tantamount to admitting his identity as a follower of the Dark Dragon. The followers of the Dark Dragon were just like the cultists in Vaunt, who were under the rule of the 4 holy shrines. They were all hated by everyone. Could you have made a mistake? He asked. No, Baba Shah seemed to react and replied humbly, Master, are you worried about your identity? It doesn't matter. We will help you in secret. We will never expose your identity, at least until the Second Judgment Day. What is the Second Judgment Day? Brando felt that talking to these witches would make him half crazy sooner or later. However, if Baba Shah was really as she said, the witches would be quite a good help for him. Witches and prophets were the first mortals in the world to master the power of magic. The ancient wizards achieved the magic of mortals by developing the magic in words and languages. The source of their power was actually the 12 moons reflected by the dark magic in the sky. Therefore, there were 12 different branches of witches walking on the earth. For example, the Roman ant was the eternal witch with the magic moon in the constellation Lyra. The strongest branch of the Bunasan of the Witch Kingdom was the Winter Witch of the Witch King. The witches had been eroded by the dark magic for a long time, so they became strange. Most of them were evil, cruel, and murderous, but there were also some kind and rational existences. However, without exception they were all firm followers of the order. No matter how different the world was, there was no denying that they were as irreconcilable as the pagans. This was why Brando would never wallow in the mire with All for One, but could accept the inheritance of the Dark Dragon. For the same reason, he didn't mind Babasha's help, as long as it didn't cause him trouble. He pondered for a moment. Baba Shah, you said that the Winter Kingdom responded to the promise. You didn't complete the dark sky curtain by yourself, did you? Master, there were several sisters with me, Baba Shah replied. Brando's mind suddenly had the same dry faces. Due to their specialization in dark magic, witches like to live in seclusion in wild areas. A small kingdom on the border of civilization like Erewhon was simply a paradise for them. At least for witches like Baba Shah, he knew more than a few in Erewhon. In fact, the Roman ant Aunt Jenny was a typical example. How strong are they? They're basically the same as me, master. Brando raised his head and looked at Babasha with sharp eyes. Babasha, you said that the Winter Kingdom would respond to the promise of the Witch King to the Dark Dragon. The Bunasan of the Witch Kingdom you speak of isn't just a few of you, is it? Of course not, they're just limited by their own constraints and can't come. Master, please don't doubt our loyalty. Babasha's face was respectful, but she was a little hesitant. Brando understood everything. He already knew that the 12 branches of the witches were scattered on the earth, and presumably they wouldn't agree with each other's opinions. Although he was the heir of the Dark Dragon, he wasn't the only heir of the Dark Dragon. Babasha came to him, obviously to invest in the long term. This old witch was quite shrewd, but Brando really didn't think highly of the few silver-ranked witches at present. He couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Babasha, you don't think you can help me with this little power, do you? Of course not, Babasha said quickly, but Sir Lord, the power of the witches has always been more about wisdom than power. Difficulties that can't be solved by power can be solved by wisdom. In the last two sentences, Brendel and Babasha did not use the whisper magic. Count Audine, who was listening at the side, immediately said, "In that case, old witch, what kind of wisdom have you brought to us?" His tone was not polite because witches were simply synonymous with conspiracy, cunning, and deceit among the people. "Sir Lord, we can take you through this area and avoid the surveillance of the harpies," Babasha replied. "Really?" Brando's eyes lit up slightly and asked carefully, "You said you can take us through this area without being discovered by the army of Jorgandi Ridge?" "Exactly. Whether to the south or north?" Brando asked. "Mr. Brando, what do you want to do?" Griffin was shocked by the princess's words. She turned her head and looked at Brando with her silver eyes wide open. She looked surprised as if she was getting to know him all over again. Yes. The wrinkles on Babasha's face seemed to have increased a few more. She was also thinking about something, but she didn't lie. "Babasha, how many people can you guarantee will pass through this blockade without being discovered?" Brando didn't care about the others. The line in his mind was getting clearer and clearer. "No more than 20 people." "I see," Brando nodded. "Your Highness, the anchor key you gave me can be used to determine the anchor point for Erwin's first royal fleet, right? How much magic power will it take to activate it?" "Mr. Brando," Griffin looked at him and whispered, "It's too risky." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 622. I know, Your Royal Highness. Listen to me, I won't joke with my life. But I have a plan, maybe we can try it. Brando said in a tone unique to players who were eager to try anything. Princess Griffin frowned at him. Really? The half-elf princess's doubtful look was adorable in Brendel's eyes, and there was a rare girlish side to her. He nodded. Of course, if we can sneak under the nose of Jorgandi Ridge, why not find a way to tear down the Door of Flame? But let's not talk about whether we can destroy the Door of Flame. Do you really believe that they can take us to avoid the army of Jorgandi Ridge? Mr. Brando, they are witches, best at using words to confuse people. The princess did not hide her wariness, but this time she was on Brando's side. Her bright silver eyes showed an obvious expectation. She did not want Brando to be in danger. Your Royal Highness Princess of Corvado, when your grandfather Old Oberg was still on the throne, I had already become a witch. The witches knew that their words would be overheard by the ravens, so they were careful with their words. Compared to the nobles who are hypocritical, you still trust them. Babasha chuckled like an old crow and replied in a hoarse and low voice. Bold people of the dark, who allowed you to call the former king by his name? Her Royal Highness reprimanded coldly. With a soft clang, the narrow and bright blade trembled slightly in the darkness. Brando hurriedly pressed her hand. Babasha. I misspoke, my lord. The old witch glanced at Princess Griffin with eyes as cold as wooden beads that had lost their luster. Babasha, the princess is not wrong. You are best at playing with people's hearts. Although witches never lie, they will leave a back door. I want you to swear to the pillar goddess of hell that you will not betray me. Can you do it? Brando pressed one hand on Griffin's hand and asked coldly. Babasha bowed deeply and said with some reverence, My lord is indeed clear about everything. We are willing to swear to the goddess of the purgatory pillar that we will never betray the Lord of Tanajal. Brando is our master, and if we do, let the blind and crippled Diaz drag us into the abyss. Princess Griffin saw Babasha put her hand over her heart. She had vaguely heard of the witch's vows to point to the heart. However, she realized that this oath seemed to be extremely terrifying to the other party. When she said the last sentence, the old witch even trembled slightly. She knew very little about witches and found it hard to believe that these cunning women would attach so much importance to a vow. For this reason, she looked at Brando in confusion. His silver eyes seemed to be seeking an answer. "Don't worry, Your Highness. They won't lie to us now." Brando took the sword from her hand when she wasn't paying attention and gently put it back into the other party's scabbard. At the same time he replied, "The pillar goddess Modesty is their belief. Legend has it that Modesty was the first witch to steal black magic from the Sea of Magic. She passed on such spells to the first generation of prophets of the 12 witches, but later she was caught by the demons, nailed naked with a pillar in the hell of iron thorns, and tortured for eternity. The blind and crippled Diaz was her first student. She was addicted to darkness and became a monster. Witches who violate Modesty's oath will be dragged into eternal darkness by Diaz, who climbed out of the abyss. This is not a legend but a real thing. Falling into complete darkness and losing the 5 senses is the most terrible punishment for witches. Since Baba Shah has made such an oath, she will never deceive us." Seeing that the princess was still puzzled, Brando added, "This is the secret knowledge of the witches, and few outsiders know about it." "Then how do you know?" "Good question." Brando didn't expect Her Highness to be able to keep her mind clear at this time. He quickly found a reason and said, "Because Your Highness also knows that I have read the knowledge of the witches. They are as old as the witches. Although they are not enemies, they are at least competitors. They more or less know each other's secrets." Princess Griffin was skeptical. She looked back. "So how sure is she that we won't be discovered? If it's just relying on the witches' spells, I don't think the commanders of Georgandy Ridge will not be unprepared. I have heard that there are more witches in the underground of Georgandy Ridge. So, whether as an enemy or an ally, they will not be unaware of the witches' means, right?" Once again, Brando felt the calmness of the half-fairy princess. In fact, he had thought of this question, but on the one hand, Her Highness didn't even understand the common sense that there were only lords underground and no commanders. On the other hand, he had a deep understanding of Georgandy Ridge. Making a judgment based on only a little knowledge, the difference was obvious. He also looked back at Baba Shah, hoping to get an answer. His plan was still just an idea, but whether it could be implemented would require more details. No victory in war was won by slapping one's head, and he knew this very well. Compared to your muddle-headed grandfather, Her Highness is obviously much smarter. The truth is similar to what you guessed. Baba Shah mentioned Oberg VI again. The half-elf girl pursed her lips to suppress her anger. The witches were so dismissive of worldly power, and in fact this was one of the reasons why they were rejected by the world. But what puzzled her was that the old witch was so respectful to Brando, and she didn't know what kind of help Brando had given them. She listened to Baba Shah continue, "But in addition to our spells, we also have some secret knowledge passed down from generation to generation. One of these secrets mentions that there is a hall under Ampere Seal that has been abandoned since ancient times. This hall is hidden between the gaps of the fjords and can lead to the hills north of the port." "That's impossible," she finally couldn't help but say. "It has been nearly 7 centuries since the late King Eric built the port of Ampere Seal here. For 7 centuries, in order to reassess whether the foundation of the Anderla Cathedral under the port is loose, the people of Ampere Seal have explored the surroundings of the port and the underground terrain more than once, but there have never been any rumors of ancient ruins. But Her Highness has to admit that long before the Erewhon people built the port, this place was no longer an ownerless place. Other than the Silver Elves, there have been other civilizations that have thrived here. The secret is a secret because it is not known." Baba Shah laughed. "I remember now. Are you talking about the Seeping Ancient Passage?" Brando remembered that there was such an ancient ruin near Ampere Seal, but it had been weathered for too long, leaving a passage between the underground cliffs. There was a brood mother that had lived for who knows how many years, a level 57 boss. To be honest, if he could, he didn't want to provoke that thing at all. In the narrow terrain, a giant brood mother with the strength of the elemental truth, coupled with her countless descendants and omnipresent spider webs, made Brando's hair stand on end. The key was that he had never heard that the ancient passage could lead to the hills north of Ampere Seal, only that one side of the ancient passage went deep into the mountains of Erech. "My lord, in fact, we don't know what the situation below the hall is like." Hearing Brando say this, Baba Shah was even more certain of his identity. Everything was as the prophecy said. The secrets of the witches were like a big open book in his eyes, which could be read at will. But since the Lord also knows about this passage, it means that it must exist. Princess Griffin also believed this time, because Brando certainly wouldn't lie to her. She turned her head. Brando, is what she said true? I've heard of such an ancient passage. Brando's forehead was sweating, and he almost accidentally exposed himself again. He couldn't help but secretly curse Babasha, these old witches, for using the so-called secret of the witches to trick him. But this passage really leads to the hills north of Ampere Seal? Well, the literature of the wizards didn't mention this. Brando felt that if this went on, the information on the forum would completely become the library of the wizards. This is a secret passed down from generation to generation, so naturally it can't be wrong. This passage connects to the mountains on one side and leads to the hills in the north on the other. That should be right, it basically matches what I know. Brando was sure that there might be a secret passage under the ancient passage. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but be very curious. In the past, because it was close to Ampere Seal, there were a lot of players who explored this ancient passage, but no one found this other secret passage in decades. After all, it was impossible to set up a secret passage inexplicably in the game. There must be corresponding benefits in it. Thinking of this, Brando's heart burned with a raging fire of anticipation. In the Amber Sword, there were too few secrets that had not been explored and discovered in the Land of Order. He didn't expect to meet one today. He looked up. Babasha, if I remember correctly? The entrance to the underground passage should be some distance from here, right? Yes, my lord. Babasha replied respectfully. The entrance should be east of Randon's Foothill Manor. Who has a map? I do. Count Audine immediately took a wooden cylinder from his waist, opened the stopper, and took out a waterproof parchment map. The accompanying knight immediately spread it out, and the parchment map spread on the ground was about half the size of a person. It was a full map of the surrounding areas of Ampere Seal. This kind of high-precision map was not common in this era. Even in the military, it was the most important and highly confidential, and it was worth at least 10,000 gold on the black market. Back then, the players didn't have such awesome goods in their hands. Brando didn't expect Count Audine to carry such a thing with him. He couldn't help but praise. I didn't expect Count Audine to carry such a good thing with him. You're really well prepared. Count Audine looked at Princess Griffin a little embarrassedly. It was Her Royal Highness who asked me to bring it. Brando immediately glanced at the half-elf girl beside him, but unfortunately, Her Royal Highness didn't have much expression on her face. She even frowned slightly. He couldn't help but sigh and look at the map. On the map, there is a place called Silver Point Hill east of Randon's Foothill Manor. If he remembers correctly, the secret entrance to the ancient passage should be near there. But before that, there was a problem. If I remember correctly, the secret entrance to the ancient passage should be sealed by ancient magic. Can you find a way to open that seal? Brando looked up at Babasha. Of course, it was actually the witches who sealed the ancient passage, my lord. Babasha replied with a little pride. She did have the right to be proud. The witches in Wonde had a very long history. They used to follow the Darkness Dragon and had a lot of dark secrets and history unknown to others. Opening that secret door requires a ceremony, and only 20 people can pass through at a time. But once through that passage, whether it's going north to the hills north of Ampere Seal, or south to the mountains of Erek, it's all up to my lord. In other words, we have to enter that ancient passage no matter what? Princess Griffin asked. More or less, unless we're willing to fight our way out, but I'm afraid the chances are slim, Brando said. But Princess Griffin still frowned. But they don't know the specific situation under the ancient passage. Whether there will be any danger down there is also an uncertain thing. In any case, it's better than waiting for death, Brando added. Besides, I actually know what's down there and I'm at least 80% sure. Please believe me, Your Highness. The princess glanced at him and finally nodded. Well, I believe you. One more thing. At this time, Count Audine suddenly said from the side. Under everyone's gaze, he walked up and pointed to a point on the parchment map. In a short while, the map was covered with water, and said, We still have some way to go from here to there. Just now, we saw at least one army of Georgindy Ridge entering the forest from the top of the mountain. If we go in this direction, will we run into them head-on? Brando looked at the map and frowned deeply. He knew that what Count Audine said was true. He had seen with his own eyes on the top of the mountain that there were sparks outside the port of Ampere Seal. That was probably the light of lava and torches. If they continued to move north like this, the chances of running into them were very high, not to mention the countless harpies overhead. He pursed his lips and frowned as he exchanged glances with the princess. Both of them saw the same meaning in each other's eyes. We need to ask for backup. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 623. Daddy. Daddy. Help me, the little girl cried as she crawled, her tears and mucus mixed together on her little face. Her white dress was already black and stained with black and red. The village outside Fort Bunyuo looked as if it had been smeared with blood. The streets, wells and everywhere within sight were stained with blood. The demons from the Sulphur River strung the residents who could not escape in time on hooks, dragged them out of the houses, cruelly killed them, and then hung them on the trees in the village. The little girl screamed for her father, but her father might have already become one of these unlucky ones. However, the demons seemed to be playing with this little prey, deriving great pleasure from the little girl's uneasiness and panic. They let her struggle in a pool of blood and mud, but every time she crawled a distance, a hellhound would come up and bite her white calf, dragging her back. The little girl screamed and struggled, and the little demons not far away laughed in unison. This was like a feast for them. They pulled out a dying young girl from the pile of corpses, grabbed her long flaxen hair with their claws, and then cut open her chest with a sharp knife. They dug out her heart amidst the splattering blood, and then snatched it and swallowed it whole. When the little girl saw this scene, she was completely scared out of her wits. When the hellhound came to her side, it seemed to have lost interest and bit her. Then it shook its huge head. The little girl's lifeless body swayed along with its huge mouth like a broken doll. But it was at this time that the hellhound creature, which was as tall as a man and looked like a giant wolf with dark fur and a huge collar, suddenly raised its head, shook its ears, and showed a vigilant look in its flaming eyes. A sharp arrow whizzed through the night sky from afar, parting the fierce wind and heavy rain. The arrow hit its smoky nostril, and the creature with the stench of sulfur instantly let out a miserable cry, its entire body flipping backward. A female knight rushed out of the rain, the sword in her hand like a sharp thorn with a cold light. Her eyes were full of hatred, and she lifted the hellhound's chin high with one hand. Flames burned from under the hellhound's fur, burning her fingers, but she gritted her teeth and pushed the sword upward. The sword went straight into the hilt. Die, demon. Go back to hell. The hellhound let out a mournful wail. Hot and stinking blood spurted out from the wound on its throat, splashing onto Freya's face. Then more night rushed out of the rain. Bess held a longbow and shot one imp with each arrow, killing them in the distance. These red-skinned malevolent spirits were only at the upper level of iron rank. They were not even as strong as the hellhound that Freya had killed. The knight passed by Freya and shouted the name of the knight. However, Freya seemed to have lost all the strength in her body as she heavily piled up the hellhound's corpse on the ground. Then she bent down and carefully picked up the little girl. The little girl was badly mutilated from her neck to her chest. Her eyes were half closed and her mouth was opening and closing, spitting out blood and pieces of internal organs. She tried to make a sound with great difficulty. Sister, it hurts. Freya bit her lower lip and tears flowed out uncontrollably. The scene in front of her was familiar. It had played out in Buchi, in Erewhon and many other places. She had experienced the same pain. The flames of war burned the earth, but the ones suffering in the flames were not the nobles of the kingdom but the people. In the past year the kingdom seemed to have returned to peace, but the same pain repeated again and again. This time, it was the people of Cruz and the nobles of the north who brought this disaster. Who would be next? Erewhon was powerless to change, just like she was powerless to save the little girl in her arms. Freya felt that she could only watch her sister die weakly. The little girl finally lost her warmth in her arms. Brando, what should I do? Freya gently put her down and could not help but mutter to herself. She turned around and saw that Bess had come behind the knight and gently patted her back. Freya, this is war. You have to learn to get used to it. She sighed and replied. But when will Erewhon end the war? When it is stronger, so strong that no one can control our fate. One day, Bess replied firmly, Her Royal Highness will do it and no longer rely on the rotten nobles of the north. Really? Freya could not help but think of what Brando had told her. But wasn't the king's party also a part of the nobles? Could those nobles really understand this pain? The more she knew, the darker and deeper history seemed in her eyes. It was like a giant mouth that wanted to swallow her whole. But then she thought of the pair of determined eyes in the sea of fire in Buchi. Why was Brando always so confident? The fog that made everyone feel uneasy didn't seem to exist in front of him. Had he already seen the other end of history, the inevitable ending? The girl was in a daze. Bunyuo's position was like the bottom of a scorched pot. Some sticks were erected far and near on the scorched earth, and some still retained a few broken flags. Scorching hot fragments of armor were scattered all over the ground. Broken human bodies, hands, feet and other body parts were everywhere. The devil's offensive finally came to an end, but it brought an unparalleled shock to people's hearts. The defeated soldiers retreated one after another, and finally rebuilt a line of defense after retreating nearly 4 or 5 miles. The genius of the Hong Kong people, Viscount von Downing, looked at the big pits in the distance and gnashed his teeth in hatred. When the big men of the Northern Coalition Army cried and asked to retreat, he should have killed them all. They were a bunch of cowards. He was lucky to survive the battle in Mar Highland. Although he was captured, he was quickly exchanged back, which made him very embarrassed. So he urgently needed a victory to prove himself. The glory of a soldier was to move forward, especially in such a war. Killing a few more devils was the qualification for future promotion. But the devil's attack was so daunting that Viscount von Downing didn't know if he still had a chance. On the other side of the horizon, a bright fire was burning, as if the heavy rain was grease, making the flames even more dazzling. Fort Bunuel was finished. He didn't care how many people died there or who died. It had nothing to do with him, but he at least understood that this line of defense had become precarious. He saw several knights in the White Lion Legion uniform walking past him. Those white lions seemed to be organizing a counterattack. He couldn't help but spit. Such a battle was unbearable. They didn't even know the enemy's fighting style. The commanders were really a bunch of idiots. Viscount von Downing couldn't help but look at the sky. His eyes couldn't penetrate the rain, but he could still see the shadow of Erwin's Royal First Fleet hanging in mid-air. His eyes were deep and no one knew what he was thinking for a while. Countess Janalesu corrected the time on her pocket watch for the last time. The fleet had completely unfolded in the direction of the Northern Devil Army. All the cannon doors on the ship's side had been opened, as if countless black holes had opened. The sun had completely sunk below the horizon, and the heavy rain had turned into a pitch-black darkness where one couldn't even see one's own fingers. But there was still a string of residual light in the sky, as well as a mottled light mixed with flames. The light fell on the Count's resolute face, outlining a few straight lines. The middle-aged man looked back and glanced at the crew's people. There are still 15 minutes. Almost all the high-ranking members of the coalition forces, crew's people, Erwin people, were now gathered on the deck. Under Archbishop Wood's gaze, Seal placed a crystal ball in the middle of the room, and on the crystal ball was Brendel's image. At the same time, Brando was also looking at the image of Wood on the crystal ball that Babasha had put on the parchment map. Brando, in 15 minutes, the crew's people and Erwin people will launch a general attack against the Devil Army from the Sulphur River, which is several times their number. We will attract attention for you. Wood, who was wearing the robe of the Archbishop, looked serious. But can you really find a way to tear down those doors of flame? I can't guarantee it. Brando replied seriously. But you and I both know what will happen if I don't succeed, so we have to do it. Me and you, it's the same, Lord Archbishop. He smiled slightly. Wood looked deeply at Brando. If he could, this was one of the faces he didn't want to see the most. The plan in Ampere Seal was almost a nightmare for him. The situation at the port had completely deteriorated. If the Northern Coalition forces couldn't defeat the Devils, then the Crew's Empire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire were likely to pay a heavy price together. Those were 3 doors of flame, and no one knew better than him the importance of it. No, there was one person who might be at least as clear as him. Wood stared at him. He didn't understand why this young man knew so much inside information. As soon as Brando opened his mouth, the Northern nobles were in an uproar. Is this guy trying to shirk responsibility? Lord Archbishop, if he can't guarantee it, what's the point of us launching a desperate charge against the devils here? We're just like fools. Is Her Royal Highness trying to find a way to consume the strength of her allies? Let's just defend and wait for reinforcements. The Holy Cathedral of Fire won't leave us alone. On the other side of the crystal ball, Princess Griffin also grabbed Brando's sleeve. She looked at him angrily and asked, Mr. Brando, you said that we should act according to the circumstances. They are devils, Your Royal Highness. I know, but you don't have to take unnecessary risks. Her Royal Highness tried to suppress her anger. Mr. Brando, we can defeat them in the end. I don't support your personal heroism. Although it's romantic, it's not the right way to do it. Brando sighed and stretched out his hand to gently tidy up the messy hair on Her Royal Highness' forehead. His action shocked everyone around him. Even the eldest princess herself froze, but Brando didn't care. To be honest, he didn't know if he could go back alive. As early as the moment he made the decision, he knew what kind of battle he would face next. Have you seen a real devil army, Your Royal Highness? He asked softly. Have you seen a real devil army? A bunch of idiots. Wood slowly turned his head, and everyone could hear the anger in the archbishop's voice. The northern nobles were arrogant, but they had to bow their heads in front of the holy cathedral of fire. Everyone was silent for a moment. Devils are the mortal enemies of order and civilization, Your Royal Highness. They are rebellious. Although they are not subordinates of the Twilight Dragon, they were born from chaos. They were born to tear everything apart. Everything beautiful and cherished is their enemy, and their pleasure is based on the pain and despair of mortals. The Holy Cathedral fights against the cultists not to suppress the voices of opposition. Those believers of chaos who obey the Twilight Dragon, their faith is to tear the world apart and make our world cease to exist. However, some people here today, some nobles who should be responsible for guiding the people, have foolishly ignored this point, which is regrettable. There are still people who remember the devil disaster in the wilderness of the Four Territories. The devils that came out of the open portal destroyed everything. Almost all the creatures in the whole kingdom completely disappeared. Who will save them? No one. Even the Holy Cathedral can't do it. Your Royal Highness, have you seen the devils walking on the earth, and the flames of sulfur burning everything behind them? I have seen it. At that time I was not a high-ranking priest of the Holy Cathedral. Millions of devils came to the world, and the Holy Cathedral used 10 years of mental and physical effort to drive them back to the Sulphur River. Today, Erewhon is going to face the same fate. Back then, on the border of Antiburo, it was only a crack that opened. Today there are 3 complete portals, Wood said quietly. He was not afraid to reveal the secrets of the Holy Cathedral, because if today's matter could not be resolved, his political life would be completely over, and he would become a sinner. More importantly, the reputation of the Holy Cathedral of Fire would suffer an unimaginable blow. On the other side, Brando was silent for a moment and decided to tell the truth. Your Royal Highness, Erewhon will turn into a piece of scorched earth. Although we may be able to rebuild it one day, there is still a glimmer of hope, isn't there? There were millions of lives here, and that might have nothing to do with him. He would not see them suffer in the flames, he would not see them die in pain, and he would not even hear their cries before they died. Everything seemed to have nothing to do with him, and he could still methodically implement his plan to rebuild this ancient kingdom on the wasteland. At least Valhalla was still there, wasn't it? Maybe it was. But Brando couldn't convince himself that he could ignore it. He could tell himself that he didn't see all this, but he couldn't deceive the truest feelings in his heart. Everyone tried to escape all the time, but everyone had the truest self in their heart, which told them what was right and what was wrong. No one was born a hero, but now at least he could give it a try. As he had experienced everything, he understood that there was only one thing in the world that could not be made up for. That was regret. Her Royal Highness looked at him in a daze. Mr. Brando, Your Royal Highness, you said you believed in me? You? Princess Griffin gritted her teeth, struggled for a moment, but finally let go of her hand. Well, I understand, Brando nodded to her, then he turned his head and looked at the image of Archbishop Wood on the crystal ball. It seems that we have reached an agreement. Congratulations, Archbishop. Wood nodded, but he sighed slightly in his heart. The Archbishop couldn't help but lower his eyelids slightly. He was indeed too rash. Maybe he shouldn't have condoned all this from the beginning. May Lady Martha in heaven bless us. I hope that Erewhon's fate is not over. He had never wanted Erewhon to continue to exist so much. At least as a cruise man and the Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral, today was probably the day he deeply hoped that this country would continue to exist. Brando also smiled. Yes, I hope the Holy Cathedral of Fire did not violate the will of the late King Gretel too much. Otherwise it would be too unlucky for me to be implicated, wouldn't it? Wood snorted. P.S. When I was writing I was killing pigs, but I found that I was disconnected after writing. I can't go up now. Pig, give me your life. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 624. The demons seemed to have discovered the actions of the humans in advance, and countless harpies flew into the sky in the starless night. The flagship of the Erewhon Royal Fleet, HMS Victory, opened the curtains of the war with its artillery barrage. A test shot and a flash of light exploded among the harpies. The crossbowmen on the side of the ship saw that the layers of feathers almost covered the strong light of the explosion, and the shell was like a stone thrown into the sea. Countless enemies. The wizard observed the effect of the artillery barrage through the porthole of the cannon door, and the light of the explosion made his face pale. He took a sheet of paper filled with forms from the side and recorded the amount of charges and magic power injected on it. The herald took the form from him and gave the order. A moment later the entire fleet roared and countless shells whistled into the airtight group of harpies. A flash of explosion burst between these monsters, and the shock wave of the explosion almost formed a wave of blood, pushing countless feathers and limbs forward, and the mutilated body parts fell like rain. The roar in the rainy night awakened the dormant earth, and the rumbling sound seemed to revive the forest from Bunyuo to the silver-scabbard sea cliff. The imagined roar of blood flowing in the huge blood vessels under the surface, and every soldier felt the ground under their feet tremble slightly, like a living creature. The flash of the explosion overhead lit up the space between heaven and earth, and at a glance, one could see a panoramic view of the potholed battlefield near Fort Bunyuo. Flags were erected on the edge of the battlefield, and then a human army appeared in sight. The human coalition army began to attack. The goal of the Erewhon and crews was to seize several villages near Fort Bunyuo to attract the demons to put more troops into the main battlefield, but the fireballs of the demon warlocks on top of Fort Bunyuo brought great trouble to the entire battlefield, and the progress of the battle was slower than expected. Freya and her sergeants and the Lantanilan Knight were moving briskly along a forest in the middle of the battlefield, and they soon arrived near Fort Bunyuo. Their goal was to seize the castle. After observing the terrain, Freya immediately ordered the attack. Hundreds of Anthony Knight immediately attacked a gap in the castle wall that had collapsed. The imps in the gap were no match for them. These skinny inferior demons were known for their cowardice in the Sulphur River. They had neither magic nor combat skills. The superior demons did not even acknowledge them as demons. They only treated them as food or even currency that could be exchanged. After a few of their companions were killed, these seemingly cruel and terrifying monsters revealed their true nature and dispersed. The knight soon arrived at the top of the city wall. The girl from the countryside of Buchi took the lead and was delighted to see the rapid progress of her side's offensive. At this rate, it would take less than a quarter of an hour to capture Fort Bunyuo. But at this moment, a demon warlock appeared at the top of the gap. Unlike human wizards who wore long robes, these demon warlocks had bulging muscles and huge horns on their heads. Like the lower demons, they did not have any decorations on their bodies. They held a burning fireball in their hands and threw it down. It exploded among the knight who rushed to the front. The shockwave from the explosion caused the Lantanilan's knights to stagger. A flying pebble even scratched Freya's face, causing the girl's face to be immediately covered in blood. But she ignored the burning pain and immediately shouted, "Everyone follow me and rush up in one go. Don't give it a chance to cast another spell." With that, she took the lead and climbed the gravel to rush up to the gap. Two imps summoned by the demon warlock rushed at her, one on the left and one on the right, but Freya raised her shield to block them, then threw them back and threw them off the city wall. Her heroic act greatly boosted the morale of the Lantanilan Knight. The knights shouted the name of the knight and rushed to the city wall. However, Freya also attracted the attention of the demon warlocks. Soon, more imps surrounded her, forcing her to slow down. The surrounding knight quickly passed her and rushed to the city wall. However, another huge figure appeared on the city wall. It was a Tauren. The monster from Jorgendi Ridge appeared without warning. It was obvious that it had been lying in ambush behind the city wall since the beginning, waiting for the human knight to walk into the trap. The monster was at least as tall as 3 men, and it held a giant axe that was bigger than itself. It stood there like a huge windmill, and it also swept the giant axe in its hand forward like the blades of a windmill. The Lantanilan knights who were charging at the front let out a scream and were cut in half at the waist. The Minotaur roared angrily and rushed down along the collapsed city wall, sweeping all the humans and demons in front of him out of the city. The human knight was no match for it at all. The monster soon came in front of Freya, raised its axe and swept it violently. "Be careful, Freya." Freya even heard the warning from Bess behind her. At that moment she was very nervous. She had never seen such a huge monster, except for the terrible wind elemental in the Mar Highlands. However, the feeling of seeing it from afar was different from fighting it up close. The huge black axe brought great psychological pressure to her. If it hit, she would be dead. No, she must not die here. Brando was still in front. She had to help him take this place. Only then would the demons shift their attention to the main battlefield. Everything she learned in the Royal Knight Academy seemed to be clear at once. At the last moment, her heart was calm, as if there was some special power flowing in her body. This feeling was exactly the same as the moment she got the Lionheart sword. The Tauren's giant axe arrived in an instant. Freya lowered her head and dodged the attack. At the same time, she jumped forward and subconsciously grabbed the place where the handle and the face of the axe were connected. The Tauren didn't have time to see it clearly and swung the axe to the highest point. Freya let go of her hand and jumped up to land on its huge axe face. The axe face was almost a meter wide, enough for her to stand on. Then she jumped again and landed steadily on the back of the Tauren's neck. This series of actions was completed in an instant, and no one had time to react. But the Tauren finally realized that the prey in front of it had somehow gotten on its back. It let out an angry moo and reached out to grab Freya on its back. But Freya dodged to the side and dodged the monster's straw-matted hand. At the same time, she gritted her teeth and raised the Lionheart sword high. At that moment, the sword radiated a bright light, bright like a beam of ice-blue flame, illuminating the entire Fort Bunyuo and the bright eyes of the girl from the countryside of Buchi. It was like a reenactment of the scene from that day. A pair of silver wings of light stretched out from behind Freya, and the Valkyrie's battle marks reappeared. The female knight clamped the Tauren's neck with her legs, clenched the sword with both hands, and plunged it down the monster's spine. With a whoosh, the flashing Lionheart sword penetrated the Tauren's neck like cutting tofu. The Tauren suddenly let out a whine. It seemed to have gone mad as it dropped its giant axe and slapped its neck with its hand. This time Freya couldn't avoid it. She heard a crack behind her and a sharp pain came. Her internal organs were almost displaced. The girl's vision turned black, and her body fell back subconsciously, but her hand was still holding the hilt of the Lionheart sword. She took the opportunity to pull the sword out, and the black blood on the Tauren's body suddenly gushed out. Freya coughed up a mouthful of blood, raised the sword again, and plunged it into the back of the Tauren's head. This time, the monster finally couldn't withstand such a heavy injury and fell forward, crashing into the collapsed city wall with a loud crash. Everyone was shocked. Freya. Bess, who went with Freya, ran towards the Tauren's corpse like a madwoman. The cadets of the Royal Knight Academy were originally comrades, and Freya was one of the few females in the academy, so their relationship was even better. But at this time the girl from Buchi's countryside was dizzy, but there was only one thing in her mind. She couldn't stop. She had already learned everything from the county. Brando was still in front of her, and she knew what he wanted to do. She also knew what she wanted to do. Freya could no longer be the useless Buchi's militia captain. She wanted to change Buchi and change everyone's fate. Brando could help her. But she was no longer the ignorant girl from the countryside. She had learned a lot. She even vaguely felt that she might have seen what Brando saw, and that was what the princess was pursuing. It wasn't just an ideal, it was a beautiful vision. When would Erwin be able to escape his fate? Bess said that the tragedy of Buchi would not repeat itself until the kingdom became stronger. But Brando told her that it wasn't just a noble's task. The princess told her that everyone had to use their own sword to defend their dignity. Freya. Bess came to the girl's side and helped her up. The knights of Lantern Island couldn't help but cheer when they saw the female knight covered in blood. Freya gritted her teeth and raised the Lionheart sword in her hand. The bright blade of the sword was more like a flag, and this flag was reflected in everyone's eyes. It was the Lionheart sword, a flag of victory, as if it symbolized Erwin's uprightness and unyielding spirit. Freya. 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 Everyone's blood was boiling, and the knights shouted the name of their temporary commander and launched an attack on the city wall. There were no more minotaurs on the city wall. Even the army of demons could not use such high-level creatures as consumables. After all, this was no longer the battlefield of the War of the Holy Saints thousands of years ago. Freya watched the black and red torrents pour into Fort Bunyuo, but her heart was calm. Bess, help me up. What, you're hurt like this? The short-haired girl complained. I promised the commander to take good care of you, and now I can't keep my precious magic longbow. Freya couldn't help but cough and laugh. She knew that Brando would never argue with her for this reason. She felt that she was in terrible pain, but she had never been so relaxed for a moment. Something in her heart had left her, but it had doubled in maturity. I seem to have suddenly understood something, Bess. What do you understand? In another time and space, Erwin's future Valkyrie smiled. At that moment, she finally understood that those words were not meant for her, but for Brando to answer his own question. War will happen and we can only choose to accept it. We were born in a very bad era and we can't choose our era. But we can try to change it. Maybe it won't change anything, but at least we have fought together with many people to achieve it. Such memories are precious. Do you know the word companion? No matter how far you go, there will be many people with you. You will never be alone. Everyone will move forward with Erwin. Forever. The situation on the battlefield changed. and the demons finally began to notice that the humans' frontal offensive was more ferocious than they expected. Although losing Fort Bunuel was not a big deal, it at least showed that the weak opponent on the opposite side still had the strength to fight back. They began to throw the army behind Georgandy Ridge into the frontal battlefield, trying to crush the last hope of these poor creatures in one fell swoop. Far away in the forest near Ampere Seal, the knights looked up at the flashes in the sky like fireworks, but they were all speechless. The group understood what it was. The flash lasted for about a quarter of an hour, and the old witch Babasha finally brought back her companions. As Brando had expected, those were the witches who lived in seclusion in Erewhon. Most of them were on par with Babasha in strength, and seemed to be led by Babasha. They all expressed their loyalty to Brando one by one, and even made an oath, of course, avoiding the attention of others. Time was of the essence, and Brando had no time to appease these new subordinates. Under his orders, everyone packed up and headed north. The knight had to walk through the forest in the dark and rain, and sometimes even had to wade through one or two swollen mountain streams. Fortunately, except for the princess, most of the entourage had the strength of silver and above, and the bad weather could only cause them a little trouble at best. They bypassed a few low hills and traveled north for more than 20 minutes, and soon arrived at the place. The secret door was located in a valley surrounded by 12 hazel trees, just as Brando remembered. But when they came out of the woodland, they saw an open space with neither a door nor anything that could be called man-made. Everyone stopped and couldn't help but cast doubtful glances at Brando. Brando didn't say anything, knowing what was going on in his heart. But he was already quite cautious and only waited for Babasha to explain. There is an illusion here that only a witch can break. Sure enough. P.S. 4,000 words. Please for votes. I want any vote. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 625. Each of the 12 witches stood under a hazelnut tree and began to chant an ancient song. 7 stone pillars suddenly broke out of the ground silently on the grassland in the forest, and a huge holy white rock rose from the soil in the middle of the stone pillars. There was a crack in the rock and the black hole looked like the gate to hell. It was easy to see that the stone gate and stone pillars were artificially carved from the natural rock. There were also some curved words on it, which had been eroded and blurred. Brando could barely distinguish that it should be an ancient dwarven text. My lord, this gate can only last for half a quarter of an hour. Please decide who you want to take with you. As soon as the white rock appeared, Babasha immediately said in a hoarse voice. Brando had already decided on the candidates in his heart. Babasha, you choose 5 reliable men to go in with me first. Count Audine, you lead the knight in later. The rest of you protect Her Royal Highness. I want you to swear to the goddess of the Pillars of Purgatory. Please rest assured, Mr. Brando. Count Audine replied with a knight's salute. His relationship with Brando seemed to have naturally become one of superior and subordinate, but the count was not narrow-minded. He understood that Brando was far more qualified to give orders here than he was, so he did not feel anything wrong. The witches respectfully did as they were told, and Count Audine sighed again. Although the witches occasionally made some transactions with secular power, they would never behave so respectfully. He did not really believe the old witch's statement that Brando had helped them, but he suspected Brando's other experience. He already knew that Brando was the descendant of Sword Saint Darius, and also knew that Brando had once studied under a very powerful hermit wizard. Count Audine suspected that it was Tulman, so he subconsciously attributed the relationship between the witches and Brando to the fact that they might have been indebted to the master of the Mithril Castle. Mr. Brando, the half-elf girl had just opened her mouth when she was interrupted by Brando. Your Highness, please stay here and let me feel at ease. Because whether it's you or me, Erewhon needs someone to know how it should proceed in the future. I may be a little arrogant to say this, but I don't want my efforts to be in vain. Princess Griffin looked at him carefully. Then I order you to come back. Can you do that? Brando did not answer. How was he supposed to answer? He wasn't sure either. Perhaps the people from Georgandy Ridge were just a bunch of brainless cavemen. They never thought that there would be a secret passage to the hills north of Ampere Seal. Therefore they came out in full force or only left a reserve team behind, allowing him to easily tear down the door of flame. Of course he hoped so too. However, he knew in his heart that it was more likely to be the opposite. The demons were heavily guarding the portal, and they only had a slim chance of success. He did not know what he was about to face. Even when he had fought his way out of the encirclement in Buchi, he had not felt so uncertain. History had completely changed, and for the first time he could not see the inevitable result behind the fog. However, there was surprisingly no fear in his heart. His mind was clear and he knew exactly what he was going to do. Then it's a promise, Brando smiled. If I'm unlucky and die, I'll let Count Audine send my body back. This joke was not very clever. The princess frowned and looked at him. She only said 2 words, live. I'll do my best. No one wants to die, Your Highness. Princess Griffin just looked at him quietly, which made Brando feel very strange. He thought that this ambiguous answer would be reprimanded, but in any case he had already made a decision. Babasha had already chosen the candidates, and she brought the 5 witches to meet him. One of the 5 witches was said to be Babasha's niece. She was a thin middle-aged woman in her 60s, and the other 3 were also close to Babasha. The last one surprised Brando slightly. It was a little girl holding a honey jar. She was less than half his height, with faint freckles on the tip of her nose, and a pair of amber eyes looking at him curiously. Babasha introduced her as her adopted daughter. Although she was only 14 years old, she already had the strength of a silver rank. Brando asked her what her name was, and the little girl replied crisply, Sugar Jar. Good name. Brando could not help but look at the honey jar she was holding, thinking that this little girl must like to eat sugar. He just did not know if the witches would have tooth decay. Perhaps they would not. After saying goodbye to the princess, he took the witches into the cave, and the 12 knights followed. In the crevice of the rock was a narrow space, only about 3 people could walk side by side. There were obvious traces of artificial steps on the ground. At this time, someone behind them lit a torch with a flint, and the smell of pine nut oil suddenly filled the cave, but everyone could see the surrounding environment. The rocks on both sides were like knives, and in the middle, there was a staircase cut from between the rocks leading straight to the ground. It was not much different from Brando's memory, but the dust was so thick that he drew a trace on the wall with his finger. Brando thought that the first player who discovered this place must have felt the same way. But then there was a sudden exclamation behind him. Brando hurriedly turned his head, and then he saw a familiar slender figure coming in from the outside. The crack in the rock closed behind her, naturally merging into the surrounding rock walls without leaving a trace. It was Princess Griffin. Your Royal Highness, you? Brando almost blacked out. He finally understood what the princess's last quiet glance meant. It turned out that she wanted him to relax his vigilance, and the tragedy was that he really walked into the trap. Mr. Brando, you are not very smart. Well, I admit that I am a fool. But I will order Babasha to take you out of another secret passage, Your Royal Highness, you can't stop me. Brando replied snappily. Unless you kill me, Princess Griffin replied coldly. Otherwise no one can take me away. You can try, Mr. Brando. I dare to use my actions to practice my every word. Your Royal Highness. Don't be so. Brando wanted to say stubborn, but he suddenly remembered that the princess was famous for her stubbornness in history. She might really do what she said. He suddenly felt a headache coming on. He suddenly missed the obedient Amandina, or at least Scarlet and Medisha were much less worrisome than the princess. Mr. Brando, I said that you are not smart, not because I lied to you. The princess saw the hesitation on his face and her tone softened a little. Have you ever thought that if you fail there will still be Erwin? The devil will destroy all of this, didn't you already tell me? I want to be with you and watch you save this ancient kingdom with your own hands. If you fail, the princess looked at him quietly, I will be buried with you for this kingdom. I will at least bury our ideals under the dust with my own hands. I want to die by my knight's side. Brando felt his heart skip a beat. He didn't know if the princess meant to say that, but when he saw the serious look in the half-elf girl's eyes, he suddenly felt that he had been seen through by her. But he had to admit that he did not think of this. If he failed, Erwin would be destroyed by the devil's invasion. After losing him and Valhalla, whether the people of Erwin could rebuild a kingdom from the ruins, whether the rebuilt kingdom would bear the same beliefs, everything was still unknown. Whether or not Awin's people would be able to survive the calamity was still a question. After losing the familiar name of the land, would this kingdom still be the Erwin he was familiar with? Not necessarily. Her Royal Highness saw far more clearly than he did, perhaps this was the difference between him and her. After all, she was a native of this kingdom, and no matter how much he understood the history of this ancient kingdom, he only carried half of Brando's feelings. He sighed. Your Royal Highness, you and I, since you admit that I am your knight, then I have to take the responsibility of protecting you. In the future you must not be so stubborn. He said, half complaining and half warning. Princess Griffin's eyes softened a little. Babasha, you lead the way. Brando said unhappily. Yes, my lord. Baba Shah glanced at the princess, smiled mysteriously, and walked forward with the torch. The light of the torch extended down the tunnel, and the air quickly left the humid atmosphere outside and became dry. The pine resin torch occasionally burst out one or two sparks, landing on Babasha's witch hat. Other than that, it was difficult to hear any other sound in this quiet underground. Of course, the rustling footsteps of the group was an exception. Brando felt that Her Royal Highness beside him was a little nervous, which was not surprising. Although she was born with all kinds of aristocratic education that made her have to remain calm and collected at all times, she was still a noble girl born in the royal family. In her life she had probably never had the experience of exploring the wild, let alone exploring the underground of an ancient castle. Anyone would inevitably have some strange hallucinations in their mind, and the princess was no exception. Mr. Brando, who built these tunnels? Seeing the mysterious tunnel under Ampere Seal with her own eyes, Princess Griffin was still curious. As if to get rid of the faint uneasiness, she asked in a low voice. It should be the dwarves, but I don't know which one. Brando replied casually. It should be the Rune dwarves, my lord. The old witch Baba Shah replied from the front. So that's it. Brando didn't expect this to be another ruin of the Rune dwarves. However, there was almost no detail in the amber sword about the background of the tunnel here, and it seemed that the core key was still in the secret tunnel that the players had not discovered. After a short conversation, the surroundings quickly fell into silence again. The tunnel began to narrow, allowing only two people to walk side by side. Brando and Her Royal Highness had to get closer. The knight also noticed that the underground stairs had begun to seep, and the traces of artificial carvings had become very blurry from here on out. The surrounding stone walls were washed back to their original state by the underground water seeping down from above. After walking like this for about a quarter of an hour, the artificial tunnel completely disappeared, and a cliff appeared in front of them. A slanted crack cut off the tunnel, and when they raised the torch, they could see a natural stone wall that was as smooth as a mirror right in front of them. Brando motioned for Baba Shah to extinguish the torch, and then he took out a crystal for illumination. This crystal was basically the kind of cheap stuff that could be found everywhere, and the light it emitted was very dim. But it wasn't that Brando didn't have a better choice, but it was deliberate. He hadn't forgotten that below the cliff was the nest of the spider mother, and using a thermal light source would be like walking into a trap. After changing the light source, Brando blessed everyone with the Wings of the Wind spell. He was just a level 20 elementalist, and his Wings of the Wind was not enough to let people fly, but it was enough to use as a slow fall spell. The group slowly descended from the cliff, and it took a few minutes to reach the bottom. Below the cliff was a completely different scenery, and the knight soon discovered that there was an underground river below. The cobblestone beach on both sides of the river was covered with layers upon layers of white spider webs. Countless spider eggs could be seen clearly under the webs. One could even see fist-sized spiders crawling around in between the spider webs. Brendel subconsciously looked up and saw that the slanted cliff was covered with dense black meatball-like spiders. They were stacked layer upon layer, and the sight of them made his scalp tingle. He couldn't help but secretly curse. This was exactly the same as in the game. When they came here for an adventure, he subconsciously glanced above his head, and as a result, he was so scared that he screamed. At that time, the spider mother was lured out, and the result was that they were wiped out. He was once severely punished by his senior sister for this, and now he still blushed when he thought about it. But this was really too disgusting, a layer of dense floating worm wall above your head, and it felt like they would fall on your head at any time. Even if he was mentally prepared, he still felt a chill down his spine. Everyone listen, don't look above your head. Withdrawing his gaze, he immediately reminded them. The knight did as he said, but Princess Griffin was very sharp, and seemed to have guessed that there might be something above their heads. Brando felt that her face was a little pale, and several times she touched his hand with her hand, but immediately put it back. He didn't think that the princess would be so afraid of spiders. If he had known, maybe he would have let her look above her head, and maybe Princess Griffin would be so scared that she would hug him. Brando couldn't help but have such a wicked thought, but of course, it was just a thought. Mr. Brando, these spiders must have some origin. Princess Griffin asked with a pale face. She knew that it was impossible for so many spiders to inexplicably gather together, and the only possibility was that there was a monster's nest here. Brando nodded. It is said that the owner here is a spider mother called Anerons. That monster had the terrifying strength of elemental activation and even elemental enlightenment as early as 100 or 200 years ago. Legend has it that its elemental element is web, and web means both binding and connecting. It can control every thread here. Right, don't touch those webs, not even a thread. Brando reminded. He was not here to clear the dungeon, and it was best not to provoke the terrifying spider mother if he could. Hearing what he said, everyone was stunned. But at this time, Brando heard a rustling sound coming from a direction. It didn't sound like the sound of a spider. He was slightly stunned and couldn't help but turn his head in that direction. P.S. It's still 4,000. The same old rule will be given to you at the end of the month. Please vote. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 626. Whether it was Wand or our world, there were more or less unnoticed corners on the battlefield since ancient times. It was like a blind spot forgotten by the eyes of the gods. No matter how fierce the battle there was or what strange things happened, it was like a vacuum in the thinking range of the commanders on both sides of the war, and no one would take a second look at it. At the Hafamili fortress at the east gate of Ampere Seal, this fortress was built around 1,400 years of the Age of Chaos. It was an elf-style fortress, but since its birth, it seemed to have been blessed or cursed. Every war left it far behind. When Eric faced the barbarians, the lord of the Charmanmin, Razor, Sahad, let go of the open east 4 times and took a long detour to attack the south gate of Ampere Seal. Later, when fighting against Madara's first invasion in the Tide of Darkness, the Skeleton Lord once again let go of this ancient fortress. As a result, today the princess's party and the northern nobles seem to have made an agreement that nothing would happen to Hafamili Fortress. After the demon invasion, the city was boiling, but the northeast corner was still dead silent. For a fortress built to deal with war, it was hard to say whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. But after 700 years of wind and rain, this fortress that had almost never experienced the flames of war was still a little old. Moss had also grown on the battlements, and the walls had become a kind of dark green that had a heavy sense of history in the wind and rain. The only difference between this fortress and other fortresses was that there was no trace of damage on the 300-meter-long section of the fortress, and there was no appearance of new and old parts being repaired. At this moment there were no human soldiers in the fortress. Instead, there were hordes of harpies clamoring on the battlements or hovering in the heavy rain. However, the coast guards withdrew on their own, and Hafamili Fortress was lucky enough to miss the opportunity to fight. The harpies watched from the sky as a large pit with a diameter of hundreds of meters gradually formed below. Hundreds of cavemen were digging in this muddy pit rather than a construction site. Of course, you could say that they were struggling. Doing anything in this stormy weather was not a wise thing to do, and 2 of the worst were digging a pit and fighting a war. Although the troglodytes had built many shelves to stabilize the walls under the command of the sorcerers of Jorgandi Ridge, collapses still occurred from time to time. Fortunately, the lives of the cavemen were insignificant. Lord Stark didn't care if 100 or 1,000 cavemen died. It made no difference to him. The only difference was how much gold he had to spend. The cavemen were extremely fertile underground in Jorgandi Ridge, and they could often exchange a small piece of land for an entire army. As long as he dug out that item within the time limit, he would be able to reap the rewards no matter how many losses he suffered. From time to time, there was a throbbing feeling coming from underground. Ordinary people often thought that it was a premonition before a bad omen, but wizards who were proficient in magic could tell that it was the ripples of dark magic flowing underground and eroding the lines of the world of order. Of course, for ordinary people this was not a good thing, but for Stark, it was like a box of gold exuding a mellow smell like fine wine underground. No, not a box but 100 boxes. According to the words of the demons from under the Sulphur River, 100 boxes of gold could not compare to the value of that thing. It was an existence that could not be measured by the foolish values of the mortal world. However, the demons abandoned the short-sightedness of mortals, and Stark also despised the values of demons. A treasure that could not be measured by gold? Wouldn't that be worthless? He shook his huge bull head and snorted at this. Stark looked down on worthless things. But this time he should have found the right place. Stark could smell the stench of the dark magic with his nose, and he couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. The cavemen under his command had given him a lot of trouble. In fact, until now there had been continuous collapses under the pit. The subterranean dwellers had no choice but to transport more subterranean dwellers' corpses to prevent them from becoming part of the new landfill, just like what was happening now. Not long after, there was another commotion from below. What's wrong? Another collapse? Can't they just do their job properly? The Tauren Lord Stark didn't take into account the fact that it never rained in Jorgandi Ridge. He was only determined that if the cavemen gave him any more trouble, he would teach them a lesson. He would throw them into his favorite maze, the maze that Stark was most proud of. Even the smart and beautiful Medusa Lysimachia couldn't find the exit. But after coming out that time, Lysimachia immediately turned him into stone for 2 hours. She actually said that he was cheating and didn't build a door for the maze. But this was also a cunning strategy of the Taurans, wasn't it? Stark was deeply distressed that he couldn't win the favor of the beautiful lady. Why didn't anyone appreciate his wit? When he thought of Lysimachia, he couldn't help but think of that cold and beautiful face, so vivid that it seemed real. But Stark immediately realized that it was real, because he saw the beautiful Medusa coming out of the rain. So, what happened again? I heard the chaos below when I was up there. Lysimachia asked a little unhappily, did you grow such a big head to balance your body, Stark? Hearing Lysimachia's words, the Tauren Lord Stark showed a simple and honest smile. This expression, which could basically be described as a smirk, completely destroyed his fierce expression. Can you imagine a cow smirking like that? This was the face that Lady Medusa saw. She frowned. She could probably guess that this big fool wouldn't say anything even if she asked, so she simply pushed him aside with her hand and looked at the bottom of the pit herself. She immediately saw what seemed to be happening at the bottom of the pit. She saw a large group of cavemen screaming and scrambling up the slope at the bottom of the pit like rats in a pot. It felt like there was a cat at the bottom of the pot in addition to the rats. What are you doing? Lysimachia was almost mad with anger. If she didn't still have a trace of reason left, she would have turned back and glared fiercely at that bastard Stark, turning him into a stone statue forever. That stone statue must be as mighty as the legendary Tauren Lord Minotaurs, and no one would know how stupid this guy was from then on. That was the most important thing. But unfortunately, the caveman couldn't answer her. What are you doing? When we heard this shrill cry that was not one bit inferior to a siren's piercing scream piercing through the curtain of rain, our merchant lady turned into a black cat with the help of the white mist. A cloud of dense black smoke rose up, and a kitten with shiny black fur and golden pupils walked out of the smoke with small cat-like steps. She seemed to be very curious about this form, but for a witch, turning into a magic animal was actually a professional spell. The white mist didn't tell her, she would soon get used to it all. The white mist watched the Roman curiously licking his left paw, then looking at his right paw, stretching out his paw to scratch his ear, and then wagging his tail. She couldn't stand it anymore, so she turned into a circle of white mist and surrounded her. Her left paw turned into a white butterfly knot and tied it behind the merchant lady's neck. Let's go, it seems to be very chaotic down there. Now is a good time, the white mist said in her usual feeble tone. The Roman then walked out of the grass and quietly came to the edge of the pit. The bottom of the pit was a mess, and it was unknown whether there had been a larger collapse or something, but the cavemen were screaming and fleeing upward. There was no brotherhood between these creatures from the underground of Jorgendi Ridge. They fought each other just to be one step ahead. If possible, they could leave their companions behind. In her fury, Lysimachia turned several cavemen who rushed up to the pit into stone, but she didn't get any answers. At this time, naturally, no one paid attention to the movement at the edge of the pit, or rather, no one saw a cat at the edge of the pit. Of course, in fact, only Stark and Lysimachia had eyes that could see. The Roman stepped lightly on the scaffolding and jumped all the way to the bottom of the pit like a real kitten. The white mist sighed and felt that the merchant lady might as well have been a cat. But she suddenly felt that compared to the Roman's curiosity, perhaps a cat with 9 lives was her true home. If there was reincarnation in the world of Wond, the white mist might think that the Roman had reincarnated in the wrong body. But while she was distracted, the merchant lady had already dodged left and right, avoiding several groups of cavemen. She dexterously landed on a reinforced board and stared at the bottom of the pit with her golden eyes wide open. White mist, look, what is that? White mist looked down and immediately saw a dozen strange creatures chasing the cavemen in front of them. The reason why she said they were strange creatures was that they looked a little like spiders, but in her extensive knowledge, there was absolutely no spider wrapped in sharp crystals. If she hadn't seen the exposed limbs, she would have thought that it was a few huge crystals chasing and hunting below. Ah, it's a crystal cluster, she cried out. A crystal cluster, what is that? The Roman asked curiously. At this time, a few crystal clusters were close to the surface. They were very fierce and bloodthirsty. Many subterranean dwellers died under their claws and fangs. But what was creepy was that they didn't kill the subterranean dwellers for the sake of hunting. They simply killed the subterranean dwellers and tossed their corpses aside as if they had undergone professional training or had experienced it thousands of times. On the ground, Medusa Lysimachia finally noticed these uninvited guests. Are they guards? She muttered and threw away the lucky caveman in her hand, throwing it into the pit. She took a short bow from her waist and aimed at the crystal clusters. One arrow at a time she shot the first two back. The few crystal clusters displayed a very powerful combat strength, which was about the level of beginner gold. The cavemen were no match for them at all. Lysimeka tested them and realized that she had encountered a difficult opponent. A crystal cluster is a crystal cluster. Let's go down and take a look. At the bottom of the pit, White Mist was answering the Roman's doubts in her unique way. Will they kill the Roman? The Roman asked a little nervously. No, I'm here. White Mist replied simply. The merchant lady nodded and jumped down, landing steadily on the other side of the pit. Only then did the two realize how deep the bottom of the pit was. The bottom of the pit had been dug through, and artificial traces began to appear below. It should be a ruin with many holes leading to the dark underground. The two casually found an entrance and went in. At this moment, there were no cavemen in the ruins and no new crystal clusters appeared. Other than the sound of rain and water, it seemed a little lonely. In fact, after entering the depths of the ruins, the sound of rain gradually faded, and the outline of a huge existence gradually emerged in the darkness. Ah! Bai Wu let out another cry of surprise. What's wrong? The Roman hurriedly jumped forward and looked up curiously. She saw the huge outline gradually become clearer in her field of vision, and then outlined the shape of a head. To be exact, it should be part of a huge stone statue. Or according to the Romans' understanding, it was a little like the marble statues used to decorate castle abbeys after being magnified 1,000 times. However, the stone statue's facial lines were very strong, and it did not look like a modern human. It was more like a sculpture made for a race other than humans. However, the Roman looked at it and saw that it had neither a beard nor pointed ears. It's not a dwarf nor an elf, she commented with some insight. What is this, White Mist? The Titan Colossus. I didn't expect it to be here. I didn't expect it to be here. White Mist muttered to herself. If she could widen her eyes, the listless woman would definitely widen her eyes to the maximum at this moment. Brando listened attentively, and the rustling sound in the darkness was getting closer and closer. But it was definitely not the sound made by the broodmother. It would not make such a loud noise. Although the broodmother was a huge creature, its movements were very light, and it was a lurking hunter. Thinking back to the experience of the exploration, Brando still remembered it clearly. Everyone stopped. The knight all put their hands on their swords, but they did not draw their swords. This was also a skill they learned from Brando. Sometimes, drawing the sword first did not give them the upper hand, but instead exposed their position to the opponent, especially when facing an unknown enemy. Brando was very satisfied with the other's actions. He was the first to see the uninvited guest that suddenly appeared. The first thing that appeared in the darkness was a floating glimmer, as if it was refracting the dim light of the illuminating crystal in his hand. Then he saw what it was, a creature made of crystal, and from the shape it should be a spider. But they were no longer spiders. Crystal cluster? Brando was slightly startled. How could there be such a thing here? This instance should not have such a monster, not to mention that there was a reason for any kind of monster to appear in a certain place. Just like the group of wind elementals under the Mar Highlands, they would never drop by for no reason. Crystal cluster monsters were very special. Brando had only seen them in a few places, and each time there were not many of them. Many thoughts flashed through his mind in an instant. But his reaction was very fast. He lowered his center of gravity, and the Haurangaya was already in his hand. Prepare for battle. Her Royal Highness shouted in a low voice behind him. The knight drew their swords in unison. P.S. Crying and angrily begging for votes. All kinds of votes. Wait, forget about the subpoena. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 627. When the knight heard the princess order, they all pulled out their long swords and lined up in a line to fight the enemy. The witches stood together with Brendel, and the two sides were clearly divided. The large crystallized saber-toothed spiders were in front of them in the blink of an eye, but to everyone's surprise, these horrifying monsters acted as if they didn't see them. They separated to the sides, bypassed them, and went straight into the darkness on the other side. What's going on? Everyone turned their heads and saw these crystallized monsters rushing forward without stopping, disappearing at the end of the darkness on the other side. Soon there was only the sound of distant spiders. Not to mention the knight, even Brando and the witches around him couldn't help but be puzzled by this scene. If something was out of the ordinary, it must be a demon. Most of the demons were cruel and bloodthirsty, so there must be a reason behind their strange behavior. They seem to be running away? Behind Brando, Princess Griffin whispered with uncertainty. Yes, they are running away. As if a flash of lightning flashed through his mind, Brando reacted. His expression changed. Each of those large crystallized saber-toothed spiders was not inferior to a human swordsman who had entered the Gold Realm. What else could make them run for their lives underground? The answer was quite obvious. Put away your swords and run, something is chasing them from behind. When Brando thought of the horror of the female spider, he couldn't help but feel his scalp tingle. He suddenly felt that he was in conflict with this place. Every time he came here he would encounter all kinds of situations. The knight was slightly startled and then they reacted. Their expressions changed as they put away their long swords and turned to retreat. Brando was afraid. They ran into Anaron's spider web in a panic and hurriedly reminded everyone to point out the way. There were layers of spider silk everywhere underground, and it seemed that it was safest to go along the riverbank. But only Brando knew that it was actually a trap. The real safe road was on the side of the cliff. He only had a safe narrow passage to pass through the cliff. In fact, there was a treasure there, but Brando was not in the mood to think about it at the moment. He led everyone through the rocky stalactites, avoiding the huge spider webs that connected almost the entire underground passage. Not long after, everyone heard a rustling sound behind them. It was like a big hand rubbing yarn. Princess Griffin subconsciously looked back and suddenly saw 4 pairs of scarlet eyes in the darkness, each the size of a fist. She was so frightened that she couldn't help but let out a low cry. Her legs went soft and she almost fell. Brando was quick and hurriedly grabbed her. Don't look back, she's looking for us. Is that the spider mother? Her Royal Highness finally calmed down the fear in her heart and asked in a low voice. Yes, that's her. Brendel nodded his head calmly. He didn't need to look back at all to know that the spider was following behind them. Dark perception was a powerful attribute in the Amber Sword. Now that it was showing its power again, Brando could clearly feel the chill on his back. However, that kind of feeling wouldn't be too comfortable. She didn't see us? She's determining our position. He wanted to tell the princess that the spider's eyes were ornaments or used to scare people. Although there were a lot of them, her real eyes were the silk under her feet. She sensed the position of her prey through vibration. Her silk was all over the underground passage, and the slightest vibration would attract her attention. The group of people and the spider, one running and one chasing, quickly passed through a large cave filled with spider webs. Brando specifically chose the relatively narrow caves to drill in and out, which greatly limited the speed of the spider, but even so, the huge monster had been closely following them. The knights were fine. High-intensity training allowed them to easily cope with this kind of situation. Even if they wore heavy armor, they could keep up with Brando's pace. However, the witches who lacked exercise on weekdays soon couldn't hold on. Several old witches followed behind, and Brando had to slow down to ensure that no one was left behind. The broodmother was one step closer to them, and Brendel could almost feel every step she took with every step she took. He couldn't help but feel anxious. At this time he was actually very close to the narrow opening in his impression. He just had to hold on for a little longer. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. The spider mother, Anaron's, seemed to realize that something was wrong. She suddenly let out a scream and chased after them. She raised her Caliceri high and swept towards Brando and the others. Right in front. Brando shouted in his heart and rolled forward with her Royal Highness in his arms. The princess groaned, and the spider mother, Anaron's giant Caliceri, swept over the top of their heads. 2 knight and a witch who couldn't dodge in time were directly cut in half. The broken human body fell to the ground like 2 pieces of wood, and then blood gushed out like a blood fountain, sprinkling all over the nearby ground. Brando vaguely heard the voice of the little witch called Sugar Pot, and screamed in fright. He grabbed Haurangaya and got up from the ground in a daze. He looked up and saw another cliff in front of him. However, on the side of the cliff, there was a crack that was half a person wide. The rocks in the crack were intertwined and it was pitch black. It was exactly the same as in his memory. This was the place he was looking for. Everyone, don't stop, go inside. Brando didn't dare to neglect and immediately shouted to the others. The knight and witches heard him and ran in that direction. He looked back again and only saw the spider mother, Anaron's, in the darkness once again raised her Caliceri. 4 pairs of blood-red eyes stared at him condescendingly. Who is afraid of you, monster? Brando had no room to retreat at this moment. He simply stood up straight, raised Haurangaya, and took a step forward. The dark blade swung in midair and slashed towards the spider mother, Anaron's Calicere. With a loud bang, Brando only felt that he had cut a steel pillar or a rock. A dazzling spark suddenly burst out in the darkness. Half of his body was numb, and he only felt a huge force directly take him out and hit the rock wall on the side. Brando raised his head and suddenly groaned. The Haurangaya in his hand also flew out of his hand. It spun and bounced off a few stalactite pillars, making a series of tinkling sounds in the darkness, and then fell into a ball of spider web. It hurts. Brando realized how far he was from the real elemental enlightenment. The battle with Williams had made him a little too hot-headed, and the aftereffects only appeared at this moment. After all, the power of a planeswalker was not his own power. He felt a burst of bitterness in his throat, and his mouth was full of a salty taste. However, this was not the time to think about the gains and losses. He shook his head hard to get rid of the dizziness, but his head was also injured. He barely lifted his blood-covered eyelids and saw the broodmother, Anaron's, swinging her 8 legs getting closer and closer to him in a scarlet scene. Brando felt his heart tighten at that moment. The knight and the witches had already approached the crack at this time, and only then did they find that Brando had been sent flying. They wanted to turn back to rescue, but it seemed that it was too late now. It was at this time that Princess Griffin, who was not far away, suddenly reacted and rushed to the knight who had been killed before. She picked up his relics, a long sword, and then threw it at the Spider Mother with all her strength. The bright blade spun and hit the Spider Mother's head, hitting her small head to the side. The half-fairy princess then pulled out her sword, and shouted to the huge spider with a pale face, "Monster, I'm here." "No, your highness." Brando coughed and cried anxiously. But her highness had already held the sword with both hands and was getting closer and closer to the Spider Mother. Although the Spider Mother, Anaron's, had awakened the elements and entered the field of elemental truth, it was not an intelligent creature after all. The awakening of the law was just an instinct. The approach of Princess Griffin made it feel threatened. It turned to the half-fairy princess with some confusion, and then raised its Calicere high, ready to teach this insignificant little thing that dared to challenge it. Brando's blood coagulated, and he immediately took out a bottle of holy water and drank it. Then he rolled forward to the pile of spider webs, and pulled out the Haurangaya from it. But at this time, the Spider Mother had already launched an attack on Princess Griffin. The half-elf girl carefully took a step back. Facing this terrible monster, her hands were almost trembling as she clenched the long sword, but she still gritted her teeth and assumed the posture of Erwin's military swordsmanship. If Brando were to evaluate her posture, he was afraid that it was completely in line with the standard, almost perfect but meaningless. The princess' sword-holding posture showed that she had put a lot of effort into swordsmanship. Just this meticulous starting posture alone was enough to make people's eyes light up and get 3 points in advance in a knight's arena. Unfortunately, this was not a knight's arena. It was a battlefield where they fought each other. In the face of a monster, no one would follow the rules of a knight. Monsters would not, and swordsmen would not. Princess Griffin had done her best. She gritted her teeth and held the Calicere of the Spider Mother, Anaron's, but the huge force still pressed her to the ground with a whimper. Then the second Calicere went from top to bottom and pierced the princess's head. "Be careful." Brando's hands and feet were cold, afraid to see the scene of Princess Griffin being killed in front of him. But it was at this time that a white light lit up from her highness, and suddenly the Spider Mother's huge Calicere moved to one side and pierced the girl's left shoulder. Although the half-elf girl clenched her teeth, she still let out a scream after suppressing it. She had never felt such intense pain since she was a child, and tears couldn't help but burst out of her eyes. Defensive equipment. Brando's heart dropped. Fortunately, he didn't have a heart attack, otherwise he would be scared to death. However, he couldn't help but secretly wipe his sweat. He should have thought that Princess Griffin, as a member of the royal family, would definitely have 1 or 2 life-saving magic equipment. In an instant, it was the difference between life and death. Brando finally arrived. He roared, raised Haurangaya and slashed at the junction between the Spider Mother's huge body and small head. But the expected scene was just an imagination. The invincible blade of Haurangaya only drew a bright spark on the hard shell of Anaron's. Brando couldn't help but feel a little hopeless. Is this thing so hard? Brando's attack still attracted the attention of the Spider Mother. It pulled out the Calicere on Princess Griffin's left shoulder, turned its head, waved its right claw and hit Brando's chest. The attack was so fast that Brendel did not even have time to react before he was swept to the ground, and he felt dizzy from the fall. He shook his head and wanted to get up again, but he felt that Anaron's raised its front foot and pressed on his shoulders. Then the huge spider lowered its body, opened its commissary, and revealed 8 pairs of sharp fangs under its scarlet eyes. F***ck, this guy can't be hungry, right? Brando's eyes widened, and he was so scared that his heart was about to jump out. After all, no one would feel good to be the next meal of a behemoth. His mind was spinning fast and he was thinking of a way to escape. At this time, Her Highness pressed on her shoulder and rushed up. She raised her sword and hit Anaron's head with her sword. The broodmother was about to bite down on Brendel, but she was knocked into the rock instead. The wound on Princess Griffin's shoulder was torn open again because of this, and Anaron's also bit a big hole on the hard granite ground in the cave, leaving a pool of highly corrosive venom. Her Highness the Princess groaned in pain, and the Spider Mother couldn't help but scream angrily. She immediately turned her head and sprayed a dark green poison arrow at Princess Griffin. Her Highness the Princess was holding the long sword with her hand against the Spider Mother's commissary. She couldn't avoid it, and the magic equipment on her body had lost its effect. She could only close her eyes and turn her head away. However, the poison arrow did not fall on her as she imagined. Princess Griffin shrank her neck and waited for a moment, then she opened her eyes slightly. She looked back and was surprised to see a light blue shield appear beside her, and the poison arrow had already disappeared. This was Water Shield, a spell that even elemental apprentices could use, but it was the biggest nemesis of Anaron's poison arrow. This was the valuable experience of the players and Brando's greatest wealth. After the Spider Mother sprayed poison twice in a row, she couldn't help but fall into dispirited state. Brando, who finally got a chance to breathe, quickly shouted, "Babasha, find a way to help." In fact, he wanted to break free by himself, but unfortunately the Spider Mother was not on the same level as him. Even in a dispirited state, he couldn't deal with her. Previously, he was lucky to use the magic breaker all to pierce the other party's line of law, causing the other party's law to backfire and kill the other party. But it was also the guy's fault for being stupid enough to pull him into the extreme plane. The Spider Mother was completely different. Even if he had a way to take out the god-slaying magic breaker all now, he also needed the other party to have the line of law to nail him. Most of the monsters were very sensitive, and they wouldn't easily use their power of law. But Babasha really found a way at this moment. The wrinkled old witch immediately said to her adopted daughter, "Quick, Sugar Jar, use your spell." The girl holding the honey jar climbed out of the crack, and then Brando saw many inexplicable creatures emerging behind her. Some looked like cows or horses, some looked like monsters or legendary creatures, and some didn't have a specific image at all. Each creature had its own name. Brando recognized at a glance that those were real names, the names with real power engraved on the codex. Most of those names were strange and written in a variety of languages. Some were even pure strings of letters or things with unknown meanings. In this world, only one kind of existence would use such a name. That was the contract spirit. Contract spirit. It turned out that this little girl was a spirit contract master, a branch of witches specializing in psychic magic. Brando vaguely remembered that it should be the witches guarding the entrance to the undead kingdom in the Silent Land, the inheritance of the witches of life and death. So it was them. He widened his eyes and looked at Sugar Jar. "Beings of this world who have signed a pure contract with Sugar Jar, please bestow your power upon me." Then a pure black creature flew out from behind her and landed on the broodmother's body. Then Brando felt the broodmother's forelimbs on his body loosen. He looked back and found that the terrible creature had fallen asleep. Thoreau, the god of sleep. Brando then realized what the contract spirit summoned by Sugar Jar was. Although Thoreau was a contract spirit, he was actually considered a lesser god. There weren't many witches who could summon such a powerful contract spirit, especially Sugar Jar, who only had the strength of a silver rank. He immediately suspected the identity of the other party. Could this girl be a direct descendant of the witches of life and death? "Hurry up, my lord." Babasha hurriedly ran over to support Sugar Jar. The girl fainted from exhaustion after casting the spell. Sugar Jar's spell has a big flaw. I don't know how long this thing can sleep. Brando was shocked. He hurriedly crawled out from under the sleeping brood mother and helped the similarly dispirited princess up. Then he quickly ran towards the knight. Unfortunately, before he could run 2 steps, he heard an angry roar behind him. Then a strong wind hit him. F***ck, this spell's duration is too short. Brando suddenly wailed in his heart. When Babasha said that Sugar Jar's spell had a flaw, he didn't feel it, but now he finally knew what it meant. But this flaw was too much of a scam. P.S. I'm a bit jammed. But after slowly writing, I found that I actually wrote 5,000 words. So I asked for votes. Sob, my performance this month wasn't bad. Asking for votes shouldn't be a problem, right? To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 628. Mother of Spiders ejected her Caliceri from the inside out and swept towards Brando's back. Like a sharp scimitar, it caused the air to vibrate as it waved, forming a transparent belt of light in the dark underground. Brando heard a scream similar to an explosion, and the scream seemed to have reached his back as soon as it came out. This was the power from the most powerful creature. At that moment, several attack patterns of Anaron's front Caliceri emerged in Brando's mind one by one. At that critical moment, he pushed Her Royal Highness forward and put Haoran Gaia on his back. There was a loud bang that made one's teeth ache. Although Brando couldn't see it, he could feel the scene of Haoran Gaia's body bending due to excessive force. The unresolvable force was transmitted to him through it, and he felt a huge force coming from behind and sending him flying. The distance between the cliff in front of him and him seemed to be pulled closer. But Brando knew that it was an illusion, and that he was flying over the cliff and over the abyss. Fortunately, the will attribute strengthened the nerve's endurance, otherwise he would have triggered his body's protective mechanism and fainted from the pain. Brando didn't want to fall into the abyss when he lost consciousness. He shot forward like a cannonball, his body tumbling in midair, although the pain was like a file rubbing against his nerves. But he still gritted his teeth and inserted Haoran Gaia into the ground of the cave. With the strength of elemental awakening, Haoran Gaia's blade directly pierced more than a foot into the rock, and a golden spark immediately appeared in the darkness. Brando's momentum was reduced, but the Haoran Gaia in his hand still cut through the entire cliff like cutting tofu. While drawing a deep incision on the ground, he still, stubbornly, approached the edge of the cliff. All this happened in less than a tenth of the blink of an eye. As if the last breath was not over, Brando had already flown out of the cliff. He brought out a large piece of rock with him, and his momentum finally came to a stop. Brando somersaulted in the air and raised his right hand with the ring of the Wind Empress. He fired a wind bullet at the cliff on the other side. The airflow converged on Brando's ring in an instant, and then it slammed into the rock on the other side. The huge gray rock was smashed into pieces, and the huge reaction force finally made Brando stop in the air. He raised his head. The sound of the wind above his head brought another sharp whistle. That was the Mother of Spiders' right front Caliceri. After her left limb swept out, the remaining 6 legs supported her huge body. She raised her right limb and immediately stabbed towards Brando, who was in midair. In the eyes of outsiders, even the silver-ranked knight, the 2 attacks seemed to have happened at the same time. However, only Brando knew that it was actually one from the front and one from the back. This was the cunning creature's most common attack. If the first strike didn't kill the target, then the second strike would be perfect. But this time no one came to distract him. Brando stared at the sickle-like claw that was getting closer and closer in his vision. But he knew that this was actually futile. The speed was too fast, even exceeding his level of in-depth analysis. What really worked was the dark perception attribute he obtained from Firefly. The magic flowing in Anaron's body was like a spark in the darkness. It came close to him in an instant. This was the moment. Brando only had this one chance. He reached out and grabbed the sharp tip of the Mother of Spiders' right front Caliceri, and then his whole body was dragged back. At that moment, time seemed to slow down in his perception. He saw himself being dragged back into the cliff by the other's retracted Caliceri, and then approaching the rock wall in a beautiful arc. He could almost see the crack that was getting closer and closer, and the faces of the knight. They seemed to have just reacted and didn't even have time to exclaim. Brando only saw some of them with their mouths wide open. Then he calculated the distance, released his hand, and the crack was in front of him. It was a perfect landing. His tense nerves relaxed. Then, like a cannonball, he flew in a beautiful arc and crashed into the rock wall with a bang. Damn it, ah! Brando let out an extremely painful scream. It was as if he never dreamed that he would make a mistake at the last moment. In any case, this mistake was enough for him to remember. The rock underground was really hard and it was really scary. But he didn't have time to be upset and immediately shouted desperately, "Drag me in!" Fortunately, the others didn't notice the young lord's little mistake. After all, it was already a great thing to be able to escape from the mouth of the terrible monster. The Knights of Lantanerin seemed to wake up from a dream, and the 3 knights standing at the front of the crack immediately rushed out and dragged him back. Brando was not far away at that time, and it was only a difference of 1 or 2 meters. The knights stretched out half of their bodies and dragged him back. On the other side, Her Royal Highness had been pushed to Babasha's feet by Brando. The old witch hurriedly helped her and shook her pot into the crack. It had to be said that the old witch looked dry and thin, but she still had some strength. "Thank you," Griffin replied weakly. Her shoulder was a shocking blood red, and the large amount of blood loss made her already pale face even paler. But until this time she still managed to show the proper etiquette of a nobleman, or the arrogance of a nobleman. Brando or others may find it difficult to understand what a noble who valued face more than life was made of, but for a princess who had been taught such a lesson since childhood, some values were natural. But for the elder princess, perhaps there was one more thing to add, and that was her stubbornness. When the princess saw Brando lying on the ground covered in blood, she was shocked and asked in a low voice, "Mr. Brando?" "I'm fine." Brando did not lie. In fact, most of the injuries on his body were scrapes from hitting the rock wall head-on at the end. He just looked like a mess. Compared to him, Princess Griffin's injuries were much more serious. But Brando did not have time to talk nonsense, because Mother of Spiders poked her head into the crack again, trying to reach in with two front claws to drag them out. Everyone was shocked and hurriedly retreated back into the crevice. Mother of Spiders was only a step away from the knight outside. She could not help but scream angrily. The sound was sharp and harsh like a sharp weapon cutting through glass. It was really creepy. But only Brando knew that Mother of Spiders would never be able to come in here, but it was not safe here. He ordered, "Don't stop, keep retreating. There are many of her children here. She will find a way to let them come in and kill us." Everyone was already frightened by Anarthan. When they heard that there were small spiders, they did not dare to stop and hurriedly continued to move deeper into the crack. Brando was helped forward by a knight. After resting for a while he finally caught his breath. He then took out the holy water and distributed it to the injured knights and Her Royal Highness. The power of the holy water was naturally needless to say. After a while, everyone looked at him with a little curiosity mixed with awe. In their eyes, Brendel was a young lord who could do anything, and there was nothing he couldn't do. Not only could he defeat the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but he could also escape from the terrible monsters. He seemed to have endless treasures on him, and there was no situation that could baffle him. Such a person might not even exist in long poems and legends. Even the knights could not help but privately think that if today's story were to spread, it might be a legendary ballad that circulated in the bars of Erewhon and even Wonde. After Her Royal Highness drank a bottle of No. 7 holy water, she held the bottle with both hands and was in a daze for a while. She looked at Brando with a puzzled look. Holy water was different from ordinary magic items because it often required both alchemy and high-level priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire to make it. Brando actually had so much holy water. Although she only saw a few bottles, this amount was enough. What's more, Brando gave the holy water to the knight, and she did not see any distress on his face. This meant that he must have more holy water in his hands. Although Griffin did not covet the holy water, this did not stop her from becoming more and more curious about Brando's experience. She wanted to know more about what secrets this man was hiding, just as she had always wanted to confirm his identity and purpose in her heart. The half-elf girl acquiesced to Brando becoming her knight, but everyone knew that this identity was somewhat unworthy of the title. Even the princess herself felt that there were too many things about him that could not be explained. Their relationship was not like a knight and a princess, but more like a relationship of equals. She had to accept his help. This relationship had once made her feel uneasy, and she had always vaguely wanted to change this relationship. But it was all in vain. She did not know if Brando could understand her kindness and her intention to seek change, but at the moment when Brando was in danger, she suddenly understood that she would not allow him to die like this. She had tasted the taste of loneliness for too long. Even her teacher, the Wolf Knight, could not fully understand her thoughts. Although Benninger's disguise was almost perfect, he was only someone who could help her. Her Royal Highness suddenly felt a little moved. Her heart tightened and she quickly frowned. She hurriedly collected her thoughts and returned to her original calmness. Because she knew that it was impossible. She had to be careful. This was already the limit. After entering the crack, the group had gone deep into the underground of Ampere Seal. The temperature rose a little. At first it only offset the cold outside, but gradually it became a little hot. Especially since there was no wind flowing underground, the air was full of a stale smell. Brando was talking to Babasha. "Babasha, where is the secret passage you know?" "It's not far north from here. I know where there should be a secret door." "So it's on the way?" Brando's eyes lit up. This was good news. He was afraid that the secret passage would be in the ruins hall in the east, or in the ancient underground tunnel further east. Not to mention whether he could remember the maze-like terrain after so long. The key point was that it was also the territory of the mother of spiders, Anaron. He did not want to provoke that female tiger and then find trouble with her. That was really a female tiger. Baba Shah looked at him mysteriously and did not speak. It was as if the rumor that the darkness dragon knew everything had been deeply rooted in people's hearts. My lord obviously knew all this long ago. She undoubtedly thought so. The prophecy of the word of darkness was simply accurate, and feudal superstition was deeply engraved in her mind. But it was at this time that Brando, who was leading the way, suddenly stopped in his tracks. He stopped and then reached out to stop everyone behind him. Everyone was slightly startled because they did not feel anything unusual at all. But after coming here and experiencing several battles, everyone had a tacit understanding and no one questioned easily. A moment later they saw a few black shadows emerging from a crack not far away. The knight looked at each other. Meeting other humanoid creatures in this dangerous underground was obviously a little beyond their expectations. But only Brando saw it clearly. It was a caveman. He made a silent gesture. The caveman's hearing was surprisingly sensitive, especially in the silence where most of the sound could only travel in one direction underground. Fortunately, after reaching elemental awakening, his 5 senses were 100 times sharper than ordinary people. Otherwise, he would have been discovered by the other party first. Except for the clans led by Abes who left the underground world and fled to the surface, there were very few cavemen who wandered outside of the underground lords. But one was already very rare. Brando didn't think he was lucky enough to encounter such things one after another. There was only one possibility for the other party's identity. That was, they were part of the underground army of Georgiandy Ridge. But how did they get here? Did the other party also discover the secret passage? Brando didn't think this was likely. Could it be that there was a passage connected to the underground of Georgiandy Ridge nearby? That was very likely. He couldn't help but frown as he watched the subterranean dwellers slowly crawl into another crack. The underground world extended in all directions, but most of the naturally formed passages led to dead ends. Some of them also led to the lairs of monsters or traps. But Brando remembered that the path should lead to the ancient ruins hall. The other party did not seem to have discovered the secret door that Baba Shah was talking about. He breathed a sigh of relief. When the cavemen were far away, the knight asked, "My lord, they?" These Lantern Island knight had previously addressed Brando as Sir, but now they directly addressed Brando as my lord. But Brando probably didn't know that the change in the details of this address was not only because the other party was in awe of his strength, but also because Iko had been telling his deeds in the Eversong forest to his knight all year round. These knights may have originally scoffed at their successor who was full of knight ideals, but now it seemed that even Iko's position in their hearts had risen a lot. It was a pity that Brando didn't know the details of this, otherwise he would have been ashamed. He waited for a while before replying in a low voice, "The cavemen know the underground world far better than we do. It's not surprising that they can find this place. This doesn't mean anything. Let's move on first." Everyone nodded as though they were going to do whatever Brendel said. But in fact, Brando himself didn't have much confidence in his heart. He only hoped that the old witch Baba Shah wasn't lying to him. Hopefully that secret passage was as hidden as she said, or else this would be a waste of effort. And getting out would be a problem. He couldn't help but glance at Baba Shah. Unfortunately, the old witch's face was hidden under the hood and he couldn't see anything, but she didn't look nervous. "P.S. I had something to do today and it was already 8 o'clock when I came back. I was a little tired and didn't want to write, but I thought it was better not to break it, so I wrote a chapter. Sorry to keep you waiting. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 629. Even though he was curious as to why the subterranean dwellers would appear in these underground ruins, he calmly buried his curiosity. He silently glanced at the direction where the subterranean dwellers had left. It was inevitable that he would maliciously speculate whether or not they would be torn to pieces by the enraged mother of spiders. But that was all he could do. Then he calmed himself down and turned around to signal the others to continue moving forward. Considering the possibility of encountering more enemies, no one spoke again, and instead lowered the sound of footsteps. The rustling sound passed through the dark underground, and the surroundings returned to a quiet peace. But that was just a facade. Everyone knew that there was danger lurking under the surface. Although the knights were not familiar with the creatures that came from the dark underground, they had at least heard that they had extraordinary hearing. No one wanted to cause trouble at this time. The cracks in the rock walls began to narrow, but gradually sections of artificial tunnels appeared. Ancient ruins appeared frequently during this part of the journey, giving the impression that these ruins were mixed among the natural rock walls. Earthquakes would often cause such a phenomenon, but in the world of magic, powerful magic could also cause the same phenomenon. I don't need to guess all of this myself, because the players have already discussed it before. Brendel carefully observed the surroundings that were quietly soaked in darkness. He did not need to guess all of this because the players in the past had already discussed this. In fact, there were players who were obsessed with exploring the history and background of the game, and they tirelessly unearthed the other side of the game's cold rules, looking for the details of the game's planners. They did have a lot of achievements, and the Amber Sword was undoubtedly an excellent game. It had countless history and details, and was so complex that it was hard to believe it was really a game. Those histories strictly followed the laws of history, and suddenly reached a perfect self-consistency. Players rarely found loopholes, and it was just like a real world. Brando himself had read a lot of such literature, but he was not the so-called story fan, nor was he a fan of the background. He simply felt that some of the missions in the game involved the ancient times in the background, and the more he knew, the better he could achieve his goals in the game. He felt that he was a middle-of-the-road player, but it seemed that because of this he had never been a top player, even though he had invested far more time than the others. However, ever since he had transmigrated to this world, his experience and knowledge, whether it was in the game or in the background, had given him an amazing advantage. He led the team through the broken tunnel for more than 10 minutes, and then Babasha stopped at a place. Before that, Brando felt that they had entered a small hall, which was completely made of green granite. This feature was very obvious in the game, and it was because of this that he found the name of this place in his hazy memory, Lotholm's Temple of Meditation. The reason why it was said to be vague was because in the game, this place did not occupy a very conspicuous position in this dungeon. This place was supposed to be a side hall in the underground ruins, a place for its residents to meditate and pray. In fact, there was a fountain on one side of the granite hall. There was a statue of God on the fountain, but unfortunately, it had long collapsed, so it was impossible to tell which god it was. Brando subconsciously looked in that direction, and sure enough he saw the fountain in his memory, but the spring water had dried up, leaving only stair-like troughs. This was supposed to be a temporary resting place for players in the Amber Sword, because in the game, large dungeons like this were generally not large in scale, and players may have to stay in the dungeon for a few days or even longer, so the designers had to design some places for them to go offline and rest. The underground ruins of Ampere Seal were divided into two parts. The upper level was the ancient temple, and the lower level was the lair of the Mother of Spiders. The size of this dungeon was not the largest that Brando had ever seen, so it only had two resting places, one in the north in the direction of the Shalek Mountains, and the other was this. Because of this, Brando could barely remember the name of this resting place. If it were the large, super-large ruins in the later stages of the game, there would be hundreds of resting places in a dungeon, and it would be strange if he could remember the name of such an ordinary resting place. However, this temple had long been studied by the pioneers, and every inch of its ground had been imprinted with the footprints of players. Witches, Black Tower mages, astrologists, and even Dwarven rune mages, all professions related to the background had been repeatedly tested here, and there could be no more secrets here. So Brando couldn't help but look at the old witch Babasha curiously, wanting to see what tricks she could come up with. A secret that the players in the Land of Order had yet to discover. Just this title alone would be an explosive piece of news in his previous world. Then he saw Babasha walking towards the fountain and couldn't help but frown. As the only conspicuous and iconic decoration of this sanctum of meditation, it naturally received the most attention from the players. The players even tore down the fountain and broke through the wall behind it, but to no avail. Is there something here? Out of curiosity he couldn't help but ask. But there shouldn't be any traps here, just an ordinary wall. My lord has a keen eye. If he didn't know the meaning of Babasha's words, Brando would probably think it was a disgusting flattery. However, many of the Lantern Island Knights' faces inevitably showed a displeased look, and Her Royal Highness also frowned, but more than half of her frown was out of doubt. As Babasha said so, she had already walked to the fountain. She explained respectfully, "My lord, you're right. There are indeed no traps behind the wall here, and there are no secret passages behind it. But for us witches, the pool itself is a record of something? My lord must be very clear that before the statue on the pool was damaged, it was the holy statue of the darkness dragon Odin. This place has a lot to do with us witches, but not every branch of witches has the ability to unravel the secrets of this place," Babasha replied mysteriously. Brendel furrowed his brows when he heard her mention the Dragon of Darkness. However, there was a discussion on the forum, and one of the possibilities mentioned that this statue may have come from before the War of the Holy Saints. Although there wasn't much history before that, the Darkness Dragon once ruled the land, so it wasn't surprising that there was a statue of him here. He nodded and heard Babasha mention that, not every witch has the ability to unlock the secrets here. He subconsciously turned his gaze to the listless sugar pot. Since the little witch cast the spell, she had always looked weak, as if she didn't even have the strength to move a finger. It was said that she would continue to look like this for a while, and she could only cast a spirit contract spell like the one just now once a day. However, the reason why Brando looked at her was because he had always been suspicious. He suspected that Sugar Pot was the purest descendant of the witches of life and death. As everyone knew, each of the 12 witches had only one descendant with the purest bloodline. For example, the inheritance of the Witch Queen was now with the Roman people, and he had once suspected that the Roman Aunt Jenny, was the inheritor of the eternal witches. Babasha saw his eyes, and her admiration for him grew even more. As expected of the Darkness Dragon, Brando heard such a voice in his heart, and the old witch smiled with satisfaction. Indeed, we need Sugar Pot's help here. Brando thought to himself as expected, but asked again, is she okay? What are you talking about? Princess Griffin couldn't help but ask when she heard them talking in riddles again. Her tone was slightly dissatisfied. There was no doubt that Her Royal Highness didn't like the feeling of Brando putting her aside. She told herself in her heart that she should be the eldest princess of Erewhon and should have more power to take the initiative. But in fact, the half-elf girl found it hard to admit that she just didn't want Brando to treat her as an outsider. She could faintly feel that Brando was different from the other nobles. The people gathered around him had formed a force that was completely different from the ancient nobles of the kingdom. This force was slightly similar to the students of the Royal Knight Academy that she had trained, but not exactly the same. The youths of the Royal Cavalry Academy had inherited her confusion. Together with her, they seemed to only be able to take one step at a time in an invisible net. She could feel that kind of despair. But she saw people like Carglass and Amandina who were full of confidence in the future, as if they already had a definite goal. In any case, this was enough for the princess to realize the difference between the forces around Brando and the traditional nobles. It seemed to be something she had always been looking forward to. Because of all this, she had begun to reject the original power structure of the kingdom. Nobles like Makarov, Fleetwood, and Duke Arek hoped to join Brando's side, even if it was not as a princess. She had such an impulse, but Griffin would never admit it. She even had a kind of contradiction, a contradiction that made her feel ashamed to speak out. So the princess kept a cold face and locked the secret in her heart, not revealing a single word. She looked at Brando and Babasha with her silver eyes, as if she wanted an explanation. Brando's heart moved slightly and he looked at the old witch. Babasha didn't care and smiled dryly. It's actually very simple, Your Highness. This pool is actually a teleportation circle. A teleportation circle? That's impossible. Brando immediately replied. He had 10,000 reasons to believe that this was nonsense. The reason was that the players had already explored this point, but to no avail. He had a kind of blind trust in the information that was ahead of this world. Those guys would never make such a naive mistake. My lord is right, this can't be a teleportation circle. But in fact, it did leave some kind of message that can allow us to have a teleportation circle immediately. Babasha was not in a hurry, and instead replied with some appreciation. Brando was slightly startled, and then his eyes lit up. You mean this fountain is actually a blueprint for a teleportation circle? He immediately asked. Exactly. This teleportation circle doesn't need the witches to draw it in a special way, does it? Wait, that's not enough, blood refinement, I get it. Brando suddenly reacted and suddenly realized, only the blood of a sugar jar can draw this teleportation circle, right? It's exactly as you expected. Babasha looked utterly convinced. But Brando was too lazy to care about her. He shouted in his heart, F***CK. These bastards are amazing. The designers of the Amber Sword were a bunch of scumbags. He didn't know whether to cry or laugh. This was obviously a series of quests. To open the third part of the ruins under Ampere Seal, it was obvious that the reputation of the witches was needed. But the problem was that there were Cruz people, Wind Elves and Erewhon people in the game, but there were no Myernas. Even Madara, who was originally a follower of the Dark Dragon, was at odds with the witches. The only place where the witches had the best reputation was probably under Georgandy Ridge, but unfortunately there were no player forces down there. In other words, to open the reputation of the witches, one had to take the risk of going against the government. Although it was a little better than joining a cult like All for One, it was basically the kind of thing that wasn't liked. It wasn't that no players had chosen such a path, but the question was, how many had really succeeded? How many had succeeded and happened to meet the life and death witches? Among them, those who had entered the dungeon under Ampere Seal were even rarer. This was originally an early dungeon in Erewhon. Later it wasn't occupied by Madara. Although Madara used to be on the same side as the witches, they later became mortal enemies because of the Dark Dragon. There were almost no well-known witches in Madara, which could explain a lot of problems. Because of this, no one in the game in his previous life discovered the secret here. Everything seemed to be natural, but Brando felt that the designers were a bunch of perverts. The purpose of the game design was to let players solve puzzles, but in his view the puzzle in this ancient ruin was obviously unsolvable. If he hadn't crossed over. But now there was finally an answer to this unsolvable problem. Drawing a teleportation circle didn't require too much blood, and it didn't need to kill Sugar Pot as a blood sacrifice. If a kingdom needed to be saved by killing a little girl, Brando would rather take another path, even if it was bound to fail. And he believed that Her Royal Highness would support him. In fact, Her Royal Highness's eyes meant the same thing. However, she was more curious about whether such a teleportation circle could be used elsewhere. This statement aroused Brando's great interest. Indeed, a teleportation circle that could be drawn and effective temporarily, even if it could only teleport a dozen people, was more practical than the so-called Door of Flame of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. After all, it was cheaper and easier to build. The Door of Flame seemed to be built by the Holy Cathedral of Fire in minutes, but it was the result of the joint efforts of more than 20 elemental rankers, not to mention the astronomical amount of money spent. If it weren't for the Holy War, Brando reckoned that the Holy Cathedral wouldn't be willing to invest in the Door of Flame for a mere civil war in Erewhon. There was nothing to be embarrassed about. No matter how important the geographical location in Erewhon was, it was insignificant in the eyes of the whole. The only difference was how much it would cost to appease its nobles, that was all. But what made the two of them feel pity was that Babasha said that this teleportation circle was a directional teleportation circle with fixed coordinates. In the past, its designer may have had the ability to design similar teleportation circles to other places, but that didn't mean that they could do it too. The technology of the inhabitants of the ruins had long been lost in the dust of history, and what the witches inherited was just a drop in the ocean. Such a result could be said to be expected, and Brando wasn't too regretful. He comforted the princess, but silently memorized the teleportation circle in his heart. This thing was also a magic circle, and it was also an alchemy work. Maybe in the future the alchemy masters under him could improve it? Don't forget that he had Tamar, the most famous alchemy master in all of Wond in the future, and according to Tamar, Amandina's talent was no less inferior to or even surpassed his, although it was in the design and manufacture of Arcanitech devices. But with the existence of these two powerful parties, Brando felt that anything was possible. He silently memorized the magic circle, and on the other side Babasha had already drawn a huge magic circle on the ground with the sugar jar. Although the magic circle needed the sugar jar's blood, it wasn't all drawn with blood. Otherwise, it was estimated that the little witch wouldn't be able to draw it even if she drained all the blood in her body. The witches didn't allow outsiders to watch their process of making the magic circle, although Brando was an exception. But Brando had already faintly sensed the princess' thoughts, so he didn't bother to look at the map drawn by a few old women. Anyway, he knew what was going on. In terms of alchemy, he may not be as good as Babasha, but in terms of blood refining, there was probably no one present who could surpass him, a player. After all, Tamar's blood refining was taught by him. As soon as the magic circle was completed, everyone stood in it. Then the witches stood in the predetermined position and began to chant. What they sang was almost the same as before in the forest. It seemed that it should be a specific ancient rune here, like the password to open the door, which was also part of the witches' inheritance. As soon as the chanting began, Brando felt the surrounding scenery blurring. He felt Her Royal Highness gently grab his sleeve, but immediately let go. There was a flash in front of him, and then he was in a completely unfamiliar place. He raised his head. At that moment he held his breath. He suddenly realized that he had forgotten a very important thing. That was, before going here he didn't ask, "Babasha, have you been here before?" This dry sentence was almost squeezed out from Brando's teeth. Everyone, including the witches, looked up, dumbfounded. They all stared at the hall with their eyes wide open. "No, Sir Lord." Babasha swallowed a mouthful of saliva. This was probably the only time she showed an expression other than that dry smile since entering the underground ruins. It was a huge hall. In the center of the hall, above the dome, a spear that radiated lightning in all directions was suspended in midair. The blade of the spear was painted with a pattern of stars falling to the ground, and the curved text on the spear was the language of the Myurnas. On it was written the most famous motto in Cruz's epic from ancient times to the present: "The spear pierces the sky, and the stars fall to the ground." To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Jianghu to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 630. In the long history of Wond, there were definitely a few major events that were destined to shine like bright stars in the night sky. But among them, the most brilliant one was undoubtedly the legend of the Azure Knight who held a long spear and opened up the era of mortals. In the epic of Cruz's creation, it was written as follows: "In the beginning, a world was born from a thought. At the beginning of everything, the world was in chaos, surrounded by water and wind, fire and lightning. Then, creatures were born in the water and multiplied on the earth. They were also blessed by the wind and endowed with wisdom by the fire." Martha said a name from her mouth: Nanaimta. 1. Light, darkness, wind, water, fire, and earth, the 6 elements surrounded this world. In the original rules, 14,000 gods were formed to take charge of all of this. It was done. In the first era before the glory, 2, the gods built a kingdom on the earth surrounded by clouds and mist. The giant tower that reached the sky connected the mortals and the gods' kingdom. But then, everything was destroyed in the flames of war. This was recorded in the Pale poem. Players had speculated more than once that this war was a magnificent war between the gods, the Golden Race, and the Twilight Dragon. That was the history of Won long ago. The opposition of all intelligent creatures and the Twilight Dragon seemed to have existed since the beginning of the era. After the collapse of the first era, the record of the Azure Knight appeared for the first time in history. The epic wrote as follows: "The Azure Knight shouted to the mountains, 'Mountains, I challenge you.' The mountains responded to him. Let the ice and snow fall on his shoulders, let the cold wind make him unable to move forward, let the fog obscure his vision, and let the cold take away his right hand and eyes." But the Azure Knight was destined to be the owner of the spear. The hero stood on top of the mountains, firm and unwavering. Like this, a year passed and another year passed. The mountains whispered, "Look, this is the owner of the spear." They bowed down and called him king. That spear shattered the sky, pierced the heart of the Twilight Dragon, caused the stars to fall to the ground, and thus started the second era of the era of mortals, the Holy Spear. The Holy Spear, the sky. 3. Everyone present was so familiar with this record, whether they were a human or an elf, a knight or a princess or even a witch. It was as if they had been told all this from the moment they were born. It was a history that everyone who lived on this continent was familiar with, whether it was a farmer in a remote place or a learned noble. Everyone knew about it. That period of history was so far away from people that it was like a legend. However, it was true and credible, and the stars in the sky could testify to it. The legendary Holy Sky Spear was 9 feet long, its spear all was like a shuttle, and its entire body was like jade. Hence it was also known as the Azure Spear. After the fall of the Azure Knight and the Twilight Dragon, the Myurnas recovered the weapon from the plains east of present-day Cruz and Saint Tassel. They carved a motto on the blade of the spear: "The spear pierced the sky and the stars fell to the ground," in memory of the hero who saved the entire Wond. And that gun was exactly the same as the one Brendel and the others were looking at right now. There was no difference. This is? The knight could not help but stare in shock. No one was willing to believe that the legendary weapon would appear in front of them without any warning and caught them off guard. There was a widespread legend that mentioned that when the Darkness Dragon died, the Myurnas who followed him brought the Azure Spear into the depths of the glacier and buried it forever. But what was going on with this scene in front of them? Brando only felt a buzzing sound in his head. The most famous weapon in the Amber Sword was undoubtedly the Amber Sword that was rumored to be able to fight against the fate of all things in the world. However, the Holy Sky Spear and the Amber Sword were both weapons of the Azure Knight, and had also left an illustrious reputation in history. In fact, when it came to the extent of the legend, the Azure Spear was far more famous than the Amber Sword. Even in Erewhon or Cruz, only a few people knew about the existence of the Amber Sword. These people were either aristocrats with a long history of family learning or knowledgeable scholars. But the key was actually here. Brando knew that the Holy Sky Spear had appeared more than once in the history of Wond, and there were even several huge scams that revolved around this famous gun. The reason was simple: because it had never appeared in history. From the fall of the Azure Knight to the collapse of the Darkness Dragon Odin's dark reign, it was as if it had disappeared from history and never appeared again. For a weapon with such an illustrious reputation to be so silent, no matter how you looked at it, it was abnormal. And because of this, it had attracted the interest of the most players in history. Brando knew that many guilds were secretly looking for the whereabouts of the Azure Spear. But it was actually here. Could it be a fake? The eldest princess of Erewhon had the highest status in this group and was the most knowledgeable. She was the first to react and asked with an uncertain tone. This was also Brando's first reaction, but the reverberating pressure in the hall made it hard to believe that this was just a fake. More importantly, he first thought of the witch empress who was sleeping under Tonajul. Could she have brought the Azure Spear here? But why didn't she tell the Roman? But he immediately rejected this conjecture because the history of the ruins under Ampere Seal was obviously much older. In other words, the Azure Spear might have been sleeping in this place long before that. But how could the witch's heritage be related to this place? Brando couldn't help but look back at Baba Shah, and the old witch herself had a look of disbelief on her face. Maybe the Darkness Dragon hid it here? Baba Shah replied somewhat dryly in the telepathic communication. But this statement didn't convince Brando, and he always felt that there was something wrong with it. Sure enough, the majestic power outside soon awakened Saint Tassol, the Wind Empress. Saint Tassol just looked at the spear in the hall and couldn't help but let out a low cry. "Ah, you actually found the Azure Spear." But she immediately reacted and reprimanded, "Brando, this witch's words are impossible." What? Brando saw that the Elf Queen didn't throw a tantrum at the critical moment and couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. The Wind Empress snorted coldly, "The Amber Sword, the Azure Spear, if Odin had one of them, how could we win? Brando, you underestimate the power of the divine artifact." That's right. Brando then realized that the problem he felt was in this place. Whether it was the Azure Spear or the Amber Sword, they were both genuine divine artifacts. The power of the divine artifacts in the world of Wond was extraordinary and had long been beyond the scope of mortal imagination. In a war on the scale of the War of the Holy Saints, hundreds and thousands of races were involved. At that time, the most powerful forces in the world gathered together, but the only divine artifact that appeared was the Blade of Fiery Flame. The power of the divine artifacts could often change history, and they would only appear when history was about to undergo major changes. Just like the narration in the Pale Poem, the former king obtained the sword on the plains, and then signed a sacred covenant with the intelligent creatures to resist the Darkness Dragon's rule on the earth. That would be another legend. Your Highness, I'm afraid we have to take it down to distinguish its authenticity. At this time, Brando heard one of the Lantern Island knights suggest. He looked back and saw the princess frowning and asked, "Take it down? How do we take it down?" Everyone was stunned by this question. Hanging in this hall was probably the most powerful sacred object since the First Era. Its power could not only change the fate of a kingdom, but even the fate of the entire continent. But the question was, would there be no trap next to such a powerful divine artifact? Or rather, not to mention that it was a trap, its own power was enough to turn those who harbored evil intentions into ashes. And who dared to say that they had no selfish motives and dared to go up and take the spear of the holy saints? Or rather, who present thought that they were qualified to be compared to the knight of the Azure Spear? The knight could not help but look at each other speechlessly, but Brando soon found that all eyes fell on him. The witches, the knight, and even Her Highness Griffin looked at him without saying anything, and the meaning contained in their gazes was obvious. If fate had summoned everyone here, then the most qualified person here to pick up the spear was undoubtedly Brando. But Brando secretly screamed in his heart, "Damn it. It was not that easy to pick up a divine artifact. It was fate, and the divine artifact recognized its master." It sounded very awesome, but in fact, most of the people who thought so ended up very miserable. If he was really Brando, maybe he would really be tempted, but half of his soul was first of all a player, and he knew very well what it was. A real divine artifact. The holy spear was eternal. He hesitated for a moment and carefully asked, "Your Highness, I know what you mean. But if we want to take down this holy spear, how long do you think it will take?" The princess looked at him in confusion. "Can't we take it down?" Brando suddenly realized that the princess seemed to know nothing about this matter. But then again, how could mortals have so many opportunities to learn about divine artifacts? Those things seemed to be illusory, unattainable existences. He could only patiently explain, more or less, first of all, the divine artifact itself has its own will. Secondly, this hall must be densely packed with traps, and collecting the divine artifact is an extremely dangerous and time-consuming thing. unless someone can resonate with it and make it automatically recognize its master. Do we have so much time to waste? Princess Griffin could not help but frown. Hearing Brando say this, she seemed to have realized the problem. They did not seem to have so much time to waste in this place. I'm afraid not. Brando shook his head as expected. The crux of the problem was not here. Obtaining the divine artifact was a very dangerous task, and if they succeeded in their gamble here, naturally all the problems would be solved. For a divine artifact like the Azure Spear, once its power was mastered, it would be a piece of cake to beat the demons and cavemen on the surface back to their homes. But the problem was that if they failed, then Erwin would not have the chance to start over. Brendel, what about the subterranean dwellers outside? She asked. What about the subterranean dwellers outside? Brendel knew that she wanted to ask if the subterranean dwellers outside were also looking for this thing. He suddenly felt that it was very possible, but where did the demons get this information? Then is it safe to leave it here? After thinking about it, although she was a little reluctant, the princess gritted her teeth and asked. For this question, Brando could only look at Babasha. The old witch was also uneasy in her heart, and to be honest, she was not sure. That was the Holy Spear of Heaven, a weapon that existed countless years ago in myths and legends that could defeat the Twilight Dragon. In that era, the silver races were only considered cannon fodder, and even earlier the divine people still walked the earth. But she still calmed down and nodded. Sir, no one can come in here except us. That was enough. Of all the people present, the one who could take things the most easily was Brando. As half a player, he could only see the Holy Spear of Heaven as a divine artifact with great power. But so what if it was a divine artifact? It was just a piece of equipment. Of course, with that said, Brando was still a little worried. He could only turn his head and try not to look at the thing and replied, in that case, everyone should forget about this for the time being. He gave the people present a stern look, especially the Knight of Lantern Island. He was not afraid that the Azure Spear would fall into the hands of the cavemen of Georgandy Ridge. The divine artifacts had their own will and carried their own destiny, so how could they be easily lost? But if this news were to spread, Erwin would be in big trouble. The knight understood what Brando meant, and all of them swore not to spread the word. Brando listened to their vows for the time being, and he looked on coldly. After all, he had his own way to deal with all of this after everything had calmed down. The means of the players were not something these guys could imagine. So everyone left the hall one by one under Brando's lead, and everyone seemed a little distracted. The shock of the Azure Spear to them was really indescribable, and even Brando found it hard to understand the special feelings the natives had for that period of history. It was like saying that those mythical characters he knew but did not believe suddenly appeared in front of him, telling him that everything in the past was real. He could only vaguely see such a meaning from the thoughtful eyes of Her Royal Highness. But just as he was about to leave the hall, he suddenly remembered something. As he knew, the power of the divine artifacts could often change history, and they would only appear when history was about to undergo major changes. In the recent history, the Flame King obtained Odorfice on the plains, and then signed a sacred covenant with the intelligent creatures to resist the rule of the Darkness Dragon on the earth. So what did the appearance of the Azure Spear in Erwin mean? At least he knew that the destiny of the Azure Spear was not to save this ancient kingdom. Brando was horrified. However, just as Medusa Lysimachia did not know about the huge changes that were brewing under this huge port, Brando did not know what was happening on the ground. The beautiful lady raised her head in the rain and saw a golden red light floating in front of her and the Minotaur Lord, who was as dumb as an ox. No, an ox. Her beautiful prismatic pupils reflected a magnificent red, and a huge door of light crossed half the sky, forming a giant flaming door with a diameter of dozens of meters in the pouring rain. Then, a fiery red demon with 3 heads and a pair of huge fleshy wings on its back slowly walked out from behind the door. Even though the portal was so huge, the demon had to hunch its body and squeeze through the door. In fact, even so, its huge horns almost could not pass through. Lysimachia looked at the behemoth carefully and then respectfully greeted, "Dear Lord Messica, you have finally arrived. Lord Valabar has been waiting for a long time." The huge demon looked at her, showing an expression that could hardly be called a smile, and replied gruffly, "What about the preparations of the bugs?" "Of course they are ready, my lord." 1. Myrna language won't. 2. It does not refer to the first or second era of the cruise calendar, but the first era. According to the player's research, this era should be before the Chaos era. And the beginning of the second era was the beginning of the Chaos era. 3. Races other than humans are called Sky. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 631. The hills to the north of Ampere Seal were connected to the relatively flat terrain around the bay. Large pine forests were scattered on the rolling hillsides, and the woodlands were densely covered with shrubs. The edge of the woodlands was downwards, and the view was extremely open on the gentle slope. But today, looking at the direction of the huge grey port, the land was scorched black as if it had been burned once. 3 huge portals stood on the scorched earth, like 3 huge golden rings of fire. Peering through the portals, one could see a world of flowing lava. It was the Sulphur River under Jorgandi Ridge, and legend said that it was connected to the scorched hell of the fire elemental plane. Countless demons crowded around the portals, including the most numerous red-skinned imps and the more terrifying longhorn demons. These low-level demons with low status and intelligence fought with each other by the portals, tearing apart human limbs. It was disgusting. Then Brando saw hundreds of hellhounds resting on one side of the hill, led by a few 3-headed hellhound leaders. In addition, there were a few red-skinned demon warlocks by the portals, who looked almost like humans except for the long horns on their heads. These higher-level demons, who were more cunning than the average person, were watching the low-level demons fight with interest. Such a battle would often turn into a bloody battle, and one side would even cruelly kill the other. But this wasn't strange among demons. Instead, it was a common sight. They were originally a bunch of chaotic and twisted magical creatures. Brando wore the cloak handed to him by the princess and hid in the bushes to calmly observe all this. Only he could see all this clearly without the help of the brass binoculars. The port of Ampere Seal had become a hell. He sighed quietly and did not have the heart to pray for the souls of the dead. Although those who died in the hands of the demons also had relatives, friends, and even lovers, to be honest, if one did not personally experience it, one would be more or less indifferent to the disaster of others. This was not human nature but the instinct of living creatures to protect themselves. To be honest, Brando himself was not so sympathetic, but he was only here to try to save as much as possible what he cared about. He had told himself that history had brought him back here, and his goal was to save this ancient kingdom and prevent the tragedy from repeating. If he gave up on this goal, Brando was afraid that he would be completely swallowed by this huge world. All his confidence came from the half-fairy princess beside him, who was looking sadly in the direction of the port of Ampere Seal with her silver eyes. What have we done wrong? Griffin could not help but mutter to herself. Brando couldn't understand her confusion, because this kingdom didn't have the meaning of history to him, only the meaning of the future. Just like how the princess was willing to put herself in danger to protect the Anderla Cathedral, he was willing to tear down the entire cathedral just to ensure her safety. But he could completely understand it. To him, there was no right or wrong between him and the princess. It was just that their views were completely different. Erwin's people didn't do anything wrong, but Cruz's people did. Little princess, the justice represented by Lady Martha is just your wishful thinking, Babasha said with a smile. The Supreme One of all things will not give the corresponding punishment because someone has done evil, but only because of the cause, and this is justice. For anyone who lived under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, this was simply heresy. But Her Royal Highness' lips moved slightly, but she didn't refute it. Her heart was soft as water, but as hard as iron. Her hatred for Cruz's people had long made her suspicious of the teachings of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. But she knew that she couldn't believe the word. Brendel actually agreed with Babasha's statement. Martha represented absolute order, the Holy Cathedral of Fire understood it as narrow fairness, the Holy Cathedral of Light understood it as serious self-discipline, the Wind Elves thought it should be no change in reverence for the law, and the people of Eloranta believed that following nature was the way of all things. But in fact, Martha herself was related to everyone, and also had nothing to do with them. The witches believed in this point best, and they never worshipped Martha as a real god, but only with respect. But he felt quite disdainful that Babasha was here to take the opportunity to strike at the princess's self-confidence. The witches themselves were also in trouble, and who in this world could really break free from their own fate? Babasha was just taking advantage of her seniority. Babasha put the crystal ball on. He reminded her lightly, "If you have anything to say, you can say it after you survive." The old witch smiled embarrassedly. She naturally knew that her thoughts had been seen through by the dark dragon. But this was not unexpected. She took out a crystal ball from under her robe, although this action really made Brando wonder where she had hidden it before. Then she put the crystal ball on the ground. The crystal ball soon lit up. Wood's unpleasant old face appeared on it. Brando really didn't have a good impression of this archbishop who played him. "Mr. Brando, your Royal Highness, how far have you progressed?" The Archbishop of the Holy Cathedral of Fire didn't seem to be in the mood to ask questions at this moment, so he went straight to the point. This question made Brando feel very ambiguous, especially when this old guy asked in front of him and the princess. What did he want? But the flashes of the explosion on the crystal ball illuminated Wood's wrinkled face from time to time. Especially at this time, the wrinkles on his face seemed to have deepened. Although this spell had blocked the noise outside, it was not difficult for Brando to imagine that the battle over there must be very fierce. He couldn't help but worry about Freya, Carglass and the others. And when he thought of Freya, he thought of the merchant lady who had not been heard from so far, and his joking mood faded. We have arrived. Brando replied concisely, from our position, we are no more than 2 kilometers away from the portal. But there are many demons over there. I will put down the anchor point next, and you will find a way to teleport the people I need. At this point he suddenly remembered and asked, I may need a few Knight of the Holy Cathedral. How is the situation over there? Can you transfer them? Fortunately, as long as you don't teleport the entire First Fleet over. Wood smiled bitterly, we can probably hold on for a while. When he said this, Brando knew that the battle over there must be very difficult. With the pride of the cruise people, they would never say that they were so reliant on Erwin's fleet. It was conceivable that the battle on the other side had reached the point of exhaustion. Brando knew that Wood didn't want to put any more pressure on him, but he still felt a heavy feeling out of thin air. There was not much time left. Then do you need those people, Mr. Brendel? Wood asked in a serious tone. I need people who are not afraid of death, Lord Archbishop. Garlock the Wanderer stood on the side of HM's Victory and watched the battle on the ground without saying a word. In the rain, the Wyvern Knight, the Pegasus Knight of the cruise people, and the Harpies were in a melee. The flames of the explosions almost lit up half the sky, and the old wizard was in the center of this battlefield. Every time the light of magic flashed in his hand, it was as if an invisible ripple swept across most of the battlefield, and countless harpies were smashed to pieces. But soon someone called him from behind. Mr. Garlock, is it? Garlock turned back alertly. As the chief wizard of Duke Cypher, the disappearance of the Duke had made him smell danger. He took the initiative to participate in the battle to avoid being involved in that huge whirlpool. Yes. He nodded. Can you come with me? It was a beautiful female officer who asked. Garlock had an amazing memory. He remembered seeing her once with Count Janalesu. And now the commander of the fleet should be with the cruise people. What did they want him to do? He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. On different warships, the same scene was playing out over and over again. A fully armored knight appeared beside the blazing swordsman Nicholas and asked respectfully, Are you Master Nicholas? Count Yenbao, is it? Please come with me. Miss Amandina, your lord wants to see you. Soon, the 7 candidates were already in the flagship command room of HMS Victory. Except for Amandina, the Shire, and Dilfrey, the other 4 were elemental awakened powerhouses. Among them, blazing swordsman Nicholas and Garlock the Wanderer were masters of the elemental enlightenment. Brando tried to choose Erwin people because except for clear-headed clergymen like Wood, it was difficult for the cruise people to really put themselves in the shoes of the kingdom. In contrast, although blazing swordsman Nicholas and Garlock were enemies not long ago, they were more reliable. What's more, Brando knew that they were not members of All for One. Even if it was to prove their innocence, they would do their best. Of course, it was inevitable that he had some dark plans. If he failed, the northern nobles would lose at least 2 of their strongest fighters. That way, Freya and the rest of Trentium's forces in the south would have an easier time. Of course, this was nothing but self-consolation. Brando, you want me? After hearing Brando's request, Amandina could still remain calm. She actually knew that Brando might borrow her knowledge of alchemy and magic, but the Countess of Yenbao couldn't help but be stunned. What are you saying? What do you mean by I want you? Brando couldn't help sweating, but he didn't expect the Countess to look so happy. No, I don't want to refuse. But I want to ask, can I really help with something like this? Of course, teleportation consumes magic power. Do you think this is the time to waste magic power? Brando was a little speechless. I let you come because you are better than the others and can play a role that others can't at this time. Brando didn't say anything because everyone understood the danger of this mission. The people who went with him were likely to die or even be wiped out. He was not stingy with his praise for people who could face life and death. In fact, any praise would pale in comparison to their actions. So, are you willing? Yes, I'm very willing. Lord Archbishop, Mr. Brando, thank you very much for choosing me. The expression on Dilfrey's face was not fake at all. In fact, Brando also knew that this young lady was too simple to fake anything. But was it really worth being happy about? Could it be that she's brainwashed by the spirit of chivalry just like Eek? Brendel thought to himself, is this girl brainwashed by the spirit of chivalry? But looking at the Countess's blushing face, he didn't want to continue undermining her self-confidence. He turned his gaze and saw Garlock talking to the Shire. You are the Shire of the Peloche family? Garlock didn't seem to be worried about what would happen next. Instead he asked calmly. Yes, the Shire replied in a neither servile nor overbearing manner. The genius of the Highlands, I've heard of you. Unfortunately, you are a Highland wizard. Otherwise, I would have made you my apprentice. Unfortunately, Erewhon people can't choose their own fate, Garlock said softly. It's all in the past and I'm no longer the Shire. I'm dead, but I have a new life. Besides, the people of Owen are not necessarily unable to choose their own destiny. Seal replied with a smile. Is that so? I heard that in the end you really did return to the mountains of Alkash. What did you see there? What did the Marshal see in the end? The Shire smiled but didn't answer. That's not important, is it? Yes. Garlock seemed to have thought of something. He was slightly startled but then slowly nodded. Hearing their conversation, Wood frowned slightly. He turned to Brando and said, I found the people you need. Brando, I found all the people you want except for Mr. Nigel. Unfortunately, he has died in battle, Wood replied. Is that so? Brando was slightly startled. He didn't expect that the famous unshakable sword in history would die here. History said that the old general would only fall in the Second War of the Black Roses. At this moment he deeply felt the change in history. He looked at the remaining two Sanctum Knight and was about to nod, but it was at this moment that a voice came from the other side of the crystal. Since the unshakable sword is dead, as a soldier of the same era as him, shall I take over his task? It was a loud, old voice, and then a tall figure pushed open the door and entered. Archbishop, what do you think? Wood raised his head and looked at the former commander of the White Lion Legion in surprise. But the old man had taken off the White Lion Legion's armor and was wearing the most ordinary military uniform. Commander Leiter? As I said, I'm no longer the commander of the Legion, Archbishop. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.